In the year 208 AD, along the muddy banks of the mighty Yangtze River, the largest naval armada in Chinese history stretched across the water like a floating city of death. 800,000 soldiers, according to their commander's boast, crowded onto vessels that creaked under the weight of ambition and steel. At their head stood Cao Cao, the most feared warlord of his generation, a man who had crushed every rival in his path, and now gazed south with hungry eyes toward the last unconquered lands of China. But what awaited him on those dark waters would not be glory. It would be an inferno that would consume his dreams and change the course of Chinese history forever. The autumn of 208 found the Middle Kingdom bleeding from 1,000 wounds. For nearly 4 centuries, the Han dynasty had ruled over the vast expanse of China, but now the ancient order crumbled like a house built on sand. Emperor Xian, barely more than a puppet on his gilded throne, watched helplessly as warlords carved up his empire like vultures feasting on a carcass. The Yellow Turban Rebellion had shattered the dynasty's grip on power, leaving behind a fractured land where might made right and the strongest took what they pleased. From this chaos rose men of terrible ambition. Cao Cao was not born to rule, but he had seized power with both hands and refused to let go. By 200 AD, he had crushed his greatest rival, Yuan Shao, at the bloody fields of Guandu, unifying the northern plains under his iron fist. The victory had been total, devastating, and it announced to all of China that a new master had emerged from the ashes of the old world. But Cao Cao was not content with half an empire. The southern regions remained defiant, protected by the natural barrier of the Yangtze River and ruled by warlords who dared to dream they could stand against his might. Liu Bei, a descendant of the imperial line who claimed legitimacy through blood, and Sun Quan, master of the wealthy southern territories, had thus far escaped his grasp. That would change. In the winter of 207, Cao Cao secured his northern frontier by crushing the Wuhuan people at White Wolf Mountain, a campaign so swift and brutal that it left his enemies reeling. When he returned to his capital at Ye, he was appointed chancellor by his own recommendation, effectively placing the imperial government under his control. The boy emperor had become his prisoner in all but name, and with that final peace in place, Cao Cao turned his attention south. The plan was audacious beyond measure. Where previous campaigns had been fought with cavalry and infantry across the familiar plains of the north, this would be different. The Yangtze River was not merely an obstacle, it was a highway that could carry his armies deep into enemy territory. At the captured naval port of Jiangling, Cao Cao seized a fleet of river vessels and began one of the most remarkable military transformations in ancient warfare. His hardened soldiers, veterans of countless battles on dry land, would become Marines. The sight must have been extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of men, accustomed to the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel on solid ground, now found themselves crowded onto wooden decks that rolled and pitched with every wave. These were not sailors but conquerors, and they carried with them the weight of Cao Cao's unshakable belief in his own destiny. He had never known defeat when it truly mattered, and he saw no reason why the southern waters should be any different from the northern plains. Yet beneath the surface of this massive undertaking, cracks were already beginning to show. The northern soldiers, raised in the dry climate of the central plains, found themselves struggling with seasickness that left them retching over the sides of their vessels. Tropical diseases, carried by the humid southern air, began to spread through the cramped quarters of the fleet. What had seemed like a masterstroke was revealing itself to be fraught with dangers that no amount of military genius could entirely overcome. Meanwhile, in the south, desperate preparations were underway. Liu Bei had been caught off guard by the speed of Cao Cao's advance, his forces scattered and his territories overrun in the opening moves of the campaign. Only the brilliant maneuvering of his chief strategist, Zhuge Liang, had prevented complete disaster, allowing Liu Bei to escape with his core followers and a long column of refugees who refused to abandon their lord. It was Zhuge Liang who proposed the unthinkable. Liu Bei and Sun Quan had been rivals, sometimes enemies, their ambitions often clashing along their shared borders. But now, faced with the overwhelming might of Cao Cao's war machine, old grudges had to be set aside. Neither could stand alone against what was coming down the river. Together, they might have a chance. The meeting between the two factions was tense, filled with the kind of careful diplomacy that desperate men practice when survival hangs in the balance. Sun Quan commanded the loyalty of experienced river fighters, men who had grown up on the waters of the Yangtze and knew every current and sandbar. His fleet was smaller than Cao Cao's, but his captains understood naval warfare in ways that northern cavalry officers never could. Liu Bei brought legitimacy and the fierce loyalty of followers who believed in his claim to restore the Han dynasty. His forces were battered but unbroken, and they carried with them the righteous anger of men who had watched their homes burn. When the two leaders finally clasped hands in alliance, it was not friendship that bound them, but the cold calculation that only together could they hope to survive what was coming. The combined southern force numbered perhaps 50,000 men, a fraction of Cao Cao's vast host. On paper, it looked like a massacre waiting to happen. The northern warlord commanded not just superior numbers, but also the resources of the richest territories in China. His soldiers were veterans of countless campaigns, hardened by years of warfare and victory. His reputation alone was enough to make lesser men flee without fighting. But numbers tell only part of any story, and the Yangtze River was about to become the stage for a demonstration of why experience matters more than size, why understanding your battlefield can overcome raw strength, and why sometimes the greatest weakness lies hidden within apparent strength. As Cao Cao's massive fleet moved slowly down the river, his ships chained together to provide stability for his seasick troops, he must have felt the intoxicating certainty of inevitable victory. The southern rebels would be crushed, their territories absorbed into his growing empire, and the dream of a unified China under his rule would finally be realized. He had no way of knowing that his enemies were already preparing a weapon that would turn his greatest strength into his most vulnerable weakness. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. On one side, the largest naval force ever assembled in Chinese waters, commanded by a man who had never known true defeat. On the other, a desperate alliance of rivals united by necessity and armed with intimate knowledge of the river that was about to become their salvation. The autumn winds were beginning to shift, carrying with them the promise of fire and the seeds of an empire's destruction. The southern commanders gathered in secret councils along the riverbanks, their faces grim as scouts brought word of the approaching armada. Zhou, Sun Quan's most trusted admiral, studied the reports with the calculating eye of a man who had spent his life reading the moods of wind and water. The numbers were staggering. Even if Cao Cao's boasts of 800,000 were exaggerated, the reality was terrifying enough. 200,000 soldiers, perhaps more, packed onto vessels that stretched from shore to shore like a moving forest of masts and banners. But Zhou was not a man easily intimidated. He had earned his reputation in the treacherous waters of the southern rivers, where a single mistake could send a ship to the bottom and a captain's career with it. As he listened to the intelligence flowing in from his network of spies and informants, a plan began to take shape in his mind. It was audacious, dangerous, and would require perfect timing. It was also their only hope. The first reports of Cao Cao's tactical decision brought a grim smile to Zhou's lips. The northern commander, recognizing that his landlubber troops were suffering terribly from seasickness, had ordered his fleet to be chained together. Ship to ship, the vessels were connected by massive iron chains and thick ropes, creating a stable platform that would allow his soldiers to fight as if they were on solid ground. It was an ingenious solution to a pressing problem, the kind of innovative thinking that had made Cao Cao the master of northern China. It was also, Zhou realized, a gift from the gods of war. Word spread quickly through the southern alliance. Huang Gai, one of Sun Quan's most experienced generals, volunteered for what everyone understood might be a suicide mission. The plan was deceptively simple in concept, but fiendishly difficult in execution. Huang Gai would pen a letter to Cao Cao, claiming that he had grown disillusioned with Sun Quan's leadership and wished to defect with his ships and men. Such defections were common in the chaos of the times, and Cao Cao, ever eager to add to his strength, would likely welcome the reinforcement. But the ships that Huang Gai would bring across the water would carry no soldiers. Instead, their holds would be packed with bundles of dry kindling, barrels of oil, and anything else that would burn hot and fast. These vessels would become weapons, fire ships that could transform Cao Cao's chained fleet from an asset into a death trap. The preparation was meticulous. Working under cover of darkness, Huang Gai's men hollowed out the interiors of their vessels and filled them with combustible materials. Reeds from the riverbank, dried wood from demolished buildings, and precious stocks of lamp oil were carefully arranged to create the most devastating fire possible. The ships had to look normal from a distance, their masts flying authentic banners, their decks showing signs of normal activity, but beneath this facade lay an inferno waiting to be unleashed. Meanwhile, Zhuge, Liu Bei's master strategist, was studying the weather patterns with the intensity of a scholar poring over ancient texts. Everything depended on the wind. For the fire ships to work, they needed a strong southeastern wind to carry them into Cao Cao's fleet and fan the flames once the attack began. For days, the winds had been wrong, blowing from the north or remaining frustratingly still, but Zhuge had spent years studying the seasonal patterns of the Yangtze Valley, and he knew that the autumn monsoon would soon shift. As Cao Cao's fleet drew closer to the Allied position, the tension in the southern camps became almost unbearable. Soldiers sharpened their weapons and checked their armor, knowing that if the fire ship attack failed, they would face a conventional battle against impossible odds. Officers held quiet conversations about fallback positions and evacuation routes, planning for a defeat that seemed all but inevitable. The night before the attack, Huang Gai made his final preparations. His letter to Cao Cao had been delivered and accepted, the northern commander apparently convinced by the general's claims of disillusionment. The meeting had been arranged for the following evening, when Huang Gai would bring his ships across under cover of darkness. It was a perfect setup, provided the wind cooperated and their enemy's suspicions remained dormant. In Cao Cao's camp, confidence reigned supreme. The great warlord had received Huang Gai's message and, after consulting with his advisors, had decided to accept the defection. More ships and experienced river fighters would be welcome additions to his force, and the propaganda value of a high-ranking southern officer switching sides would be considerable. Orders went out to prepare a suitable welcome for the new allies, complete with banquets and ceremonies to mark their change of allegiance. The irony was perfect. Cao Cao's very success, his reputation for inevitability, and his ability to attract defectors was being used against him. His enemies understood him well enough to exploit his strengths as much as his weaknesses, turning his confidence into complacency and his generosity into vulnerability. As the sun set on what would prove to be the last peaceful night for Cao Cao's ambitions, both sides made their final preparations. In the south, fire ships were positioned, and skeleton crews received their desperate instructions. They would sail their vessels into the heart of the enemy fleet, light the fires when they were close enough to ensure success, and then leap into small boats that would hopefully carry them to safety. In the north, soldiers cleaned their weapons and dreamed of the easy victory that awaited them. Many wrote letters home, describing the wealth they would soon acquire and the glory that would be theirs. The chained ships rocked gently in the current, their stability a comfort to men who had spent too many nights fighting nausea and homesickness. The stage was set for an encounter that would echo through Chinese history for centuries. On one side lay the largest military force ever assembled on Chinese waters, commanded by a general who had never known strategic defeat. On the other waited a desperate alliance armed with nothing but cunning, local knowledge, and a plan so dangerous that even its architects could not be to shift, certain it would work. The wind was beginning. Dawn broke over the Yangtze with deceptive calm, the morning mist rising from the water like the breath of sleeping dragons. But beneath this tranquil surface, the currents of history were already shifting. Huang Gai stood on the deck of his lead vessel, watching the wind vanes flutter in the strengthening breeze. The southeastern wind had finally come, just as Zhuge had predicted it would. The gods of war, it seemed, had chosen their side. Across the water, Cao Cao's massive fleet lay at anchor like a city built upon the waves. The chained vessels stretched for miles, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope that blocked out portions of the sky. Banners fluttered in the growing wind, displaying the symbols of a dozen conquered territories and the personal emblems of generals who had never tasted defeat. It was a sight to inspire terror in any enemy, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that resistance seemed not just futile but insane. Yet Huang Gai felt no fear as he gazed upon this armada of doom. Instead, he saw opportunity written in every chain that bound ship to ship, in every gap between the vessels where fire might spread, in every banner that would soon become kindling for an inferno, unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. The very magnificence of Cao Cao's fleet was about to become its curse. The signal came just as the sun reached its zenith. From the southern shore, a single torch flared bright against the afternoon sky, held aloft by Zhou himself. It was time. Huang Gai turned to his small crew, men who had volunteered for what they all understood might be a journey to the afterlife. Their faces were grim but resolute, bearing the expression of soldiers who had made their peace with death in service of something greater than themselves. The fire ships began their final approach in loose formation, maintaining the appearance of a legitimate defection until the very last moment. Below decks, the carefully arranged combustibles waited in darkness, oil-soaked timber and bundles of reeds that would transform these vessels into floating pyres. The skeleton crews moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role in the deadly choreography that was about to unfold. From his command vessel, Cao Cao watched the approaching ships with satisfaction. Intelligence reports had confirmed Huang Gai's growing dissatisfaction with Sun Quan's leadership, and the timing of his defection could not have been better. Fresh troops and experienced naval officers would be invaluable assets in the campaigns to come. The warlord was already planning the ceremonies that would welcome these new allies into his service, the banquets and rewards that would demonstrate his magnanimity to other potential defectors. His advisors stood nearby, some expressing quiet concerns about accepting enemy vessels so close to the main fleet. But their voices were drowned out by the chorus of flattery from courtiers eager to please their master. Cao Cao had surrounded himself with men who told him what he wanted to hear, and what he wanted to hear was that victory was inevitable, that his enemies were crumbling, and that the unification of China was merely a matter of time. The fire ships drew closer, their crews maintaining perfect discipline as they navigated between the anchored vessels of Cao Cao's fleet. Northern soldiers lined the rails of the chained ships, curious to see these southern warriors who had supposedly abandoned their cause. Many called out greetings, welcoming the newcomers with the easy camaraderie of men who believed they served the winning side. Huang Gai himself stood prominently on the deck of his lead vessel, playing his part to perfection. He returned the waves and shouts of the northern soldiers, even as his hand rested on the hilt of his sword and his eyes calculated distances and wind patterns. Everything depended on timing. Too early, and the fire ships might be stopped before they could spread their deadly cargo. Too late, and the crews might not escape before the flames consumed everything in their path. The moment came without fanfare, marked only by Huang Gai's sharp whistle cutting through the afternoon air. Across the fire ships, men moved with desperate speed, igniting oil-soaked torches and thrusting them deep into the prepared combustibles. The response was immediate and terrifying. Flames erupted from the holds of the vessels like demons bursting from the underworld, orange and red tongues of destruction that licked hungrily at the wooden decks and rigging above. The transformation was instantaneous. Ships that had moments before appeared as peaceful vessels of defection were suddenly revealed as instruments of annihilation. The carefully arranged kindling caught fire with explosive force, sending pillars of flame shooting skyward and turning the evening air into a furnace of superheated death. The southeastern wind, that gift from heaven that Zhuge Liang had promised, seized the fires and drove them forward with the fury of a typhoon. Panic erupted across Cao Cao's fleet as the true nature of Huang Gai's mission became horrifyingly clear. Officers shouted contradictory orders, while soldiers ran in circles, unsure whether to fight the approaching flames or prepare to abandon ship. The chained vessels, moments before a symbol of stability and strength, now became a trap from which there could be no escape. As the fire ships smashed into the northern fleet, their blazing hulks clinging to the chained vessels like burning leeches, the flames spread with a speed that defied belief. The sound was beyond description. The roar of the fire mixed with the screams of burning men, the crash of falling masts, and the thunder of exploding stores of oil and tar. Horses, brought aboard to serve the cavalry units, shrieked in terror as their stalls filled with smoke and flame. The great chain that had seemed so clever, so practical, now conducted the fire from ship to ship with mechanical efficiency, turning Cao Cao's entire fleet into a single massive pyre. Men leaped into the dark waters of the Yangtze, their clothing and hair ablaze, only to discover that the river itself had become a trap. Those who could not swim drowned quickly in the heavy armor they wore. Those who could swim found themselves caught in currents that swept them toward burning debris or into the path of other desperate soldiers thrashing in the water. The surface of the river became choked with bodies, some still moving, others already claimed by the flames or the depths. Cao Cao himself stood on the deck of his flagship, watching in stunned silence as decades of careful planning and preparation dissolved into chaos and ash. This was not how the story was supposed to end. He was the master of northern China, the man who had never known true defeat, the architect of a new dynasty that would reunify the Middle Kingdom under his rule. Yet here he stood, helpless, as his dreams burned around him and the night sky glowed with the light of his own destruction. The fire spread beyond the fleet itself, carried by wind and burning debris to the camps that had been established along the shore. Tents and supply wagons erupted in flames as sparks and ash rained down like deadly snow. Soldiers who had escaped the burning ships found themselves trapped between the blazing river and camps that had become infernos. The very magnitude of Cao Cao's force, which had seemed like such an advantage, now worked against him as masses of panicked men trampled each other in their desperation to escape the conflagration. Zhou had timed his follow-up assault perfectly. As the fire ships completed their work and the northern fleet dissolved into chaos, the southern forces struck from multiple directions. War drums thundered across the water as small, nimble vessels packed with fresh troops emerged from hidden anchorages along the shore. These were not the desperate survivors of a defeated army, but seasoned fighters who had spent their lives on these waters, moving through smoke and flame with the confidence of men fighting on familiar ground. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than a massacre. Cao Cao's surviving soldiers, demoralized and disorganized, could offer little resistance to the coordinated assault of their enemies. Those who had not been killed or wounded in the fire found themselves facing fresh troops while they were exhausted, smoke-blinded, and separated from their units. The southern forces showed no mercy, cutting down fleeing northerners and capturing those too wounded to resist. By midnight, the greatest naval fleet in Chinese history had ceased to exist. Where hundreds of vessels had once anchored in perfect formation, only burning wreckage remained, drifting slowly downstream like funeral pyres for an empire's ambitions. The Yangtze ran red with blood and black with ash, its waters choked with the debris of Cao Cao's shattered dreams. The great warlord himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing north with a handful of loyal followers as his surviving forces disintegrated around him. The man who had boasted of commanding 800,000 warriors now led perhaps a few thousand demoralized survivors, their faces bearing the haunted expressions of men who had witnessed the impossible. The unifier of China had become a refugee in his own empire, his reputation for invincibility shattered as thoroughly as his fleet. As dawn broke over the Yangtze, revealing the full scope of the catastrophe, messengers raced north and south with news that would reshape the political landscape of China. Cao Cao's defeat was not merely a military setback, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power that would echo through the centuries. The dream of reunification had died in the flames of Red Cliffs, and in its place rose the reality of a divided realm where three kingdoms would struggle for supremacy for generations to come. The fire ships had accomplished more than their creators had dared hope. They had not merely defeated an army, but had altered the course of Chinese civilization itself, ensuring that the ancient land would remain fractured and that the stories born from this division would captivate imaginations for 1,000 years and more. The flames that consumed Cao Cao's fleet at Red Cliffs did more than destroy ships and soldiers. They incinerated the last hope of reunifying China under a single ruler and gave birth to an era that would define Chinese culture for millennia. From the ashes of that terrible night rose the Three Kingdoms period, a time of legendary heroes and epic battles that would inspire countless stories, poems, and works of art. Cao Cao's dream of empire died on the Yangtze, but his defeat became something far more powerful than any victory could have been. It became legend. The fire ships of Huang Gai, the strategic brilliance of Zhuge Liang, and the desperate courage of Zhou would echo through Chinese history, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from overwhelming strength, but from understanding your enemy's weaknesses and having the audacity to exploit them. The Battle of Red Cliffs reminds us that in war, as in life, the mightiest forces can be undone by the smallest flames, and that sometimes it takes an inferno to forge a legend that will burn bright in human memory forever. The Yangtze still flows today, carrying with it the echoes of that ancient fire and the stories of the men who dared to challenge the impossible. In the winter of 208 AD, along the muddy banks of the mighty Yangtze River, two massive armies faced each other in what would become one of history's most legendary naval battles. But this wasn't just a clash of steel and strategy. According to ancient Chinese beliefs, the very forces of nature themselves had chosen sides, and a mystical curse was about to turn the tide of an empire. Picture this: the most powerful warlord in all of China, commanding nearly 800,000 troops, stands poised to crush his enemies and unite the fractured realm under his iron fist. His fleet stretches across the river like a floating city, ships chained together in an unbreakable wall of wood and bronze. Victory seems inevitable, yet within days, this unstoppable armada would be nothing but smoke and ash, consumed by flames that seem to dance with supernatural fury. This is the story of the Battle of Red Cliffs, where ancient Chinese mysticism collided with military might, and where the delicate balance of Feng Shui may have decided the fate of an entire civilization. By the end of this tale, you'll understand how the ancient Chinese belief in cosmic harmony, wind patterns, and spiritual curses shaped one of the most decisive moments in human history. The year 208 AD found China in chaos. The mighty Han dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 4 centuries, was crumbling like a house built on sand. Regional warlords carved up the empire like wolves tearing at a carcass, each claiming legitimacy while the true emperor cowered as a mere puppet in his palace. Among these ambitious generals, one name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies: Cao Cao. Cao Cao was no ordinary warlord. Known as the Chancellor of Han, he had systematically crushed rebellion after rebellion, absorbing their armies into his own growing war machine. By 208, he controlled all of northern China, commanding a force so vast that when his soldiers marched, the earth trembled for miles around. Ancient chroniclers described his army as a black tide that devoured everything in its path. Villages emptied at news of his approach. Rivers ran red where he had passed. But Cao Cao's hunger for power knew no bounds. Northern China was merely the appetizer. His true prize lay across the Yangtze River in the lush, wealthy lands of the south. There, two rival warlords had carved out their own domains: Liu Bei, who claimed to be the rightful heir to the Han legacy, and Sun Quan, the young master of the prosperous Jiangdong region. Separately, neither could hope to match Cao Cao's might. Together, they might stand a chance. The Southern Coalition was a study in contrasts. Liu Bei was the idealist, a man who claimed royal blood and preached about restoring the glory of the Han dynasty. His followers saw him as a benevolent leader who genuinely cared for the common people. Sun Quan, meanwhile, was the pragmatist. Young but shrewd, he had inherited a maritime empire built on trade and naval power. Where Liu Bei inspired through righteousness, Sun Quan commanded through competence. As winter approached in 208, Cao Cao's massive army began its southward march. The very ground seemed to groan under the weight of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, siege engines, and supply wagons. Scouts reported that the column stretched for over 50 miles, a serpent of steel and leather winding through the Chinese countryside. Wherever they passed, the sky darkened with smoke from burning granaries and villages. Cao Cao employed the ancient strategy of living off the land, taking what he needed and destroying what he couldn't use to deny it to his enemies. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical destruction. Messengers arrived daily at the courts of Liu Bei and Sun Quan, carrying reports of Cao Cao's overwhelming strength. Some advisors whispered that resistance was futile, that they should surrender now and hope for mercy. Others spoke of fleeing south, abandoning their territories to preserve their lives. The weight of impending doom pressed down on the alliance like a physical force. Yet it was in this darkest hour that the ancient Chinese understanding of Feng Shui began to play its mysterious role. Feng Shui, literally meaning wind and water, was far more than mere superstition to the people of ancient China. It represented the fundamental belief that invisible forces flowed through the natural world, that the positioning of mountains, rivers, buildings, and even armies could harness or disrupt these cosmic energies. The learned men of both southern courts began studying the omens with growing excitement. The Yangtze River, they noted, flowed from west to east, carrying with it the life force of the entire region. Cao Cao's army, approaching from the north, would be forced to cross this mighty barrier, disrupting the natural flow of qi, the vital energy that sustained all life. More intriguingly, the winter season brought with it specific wind patterns that had blown unchanged for countless generations. Among the southern strategists, one name began to emerge as particularly gifted in reading these cosmic signs: Zhuge Liang. Known as the Sleeping Dragon, Zhuge Liang served as Liu Bei's chief advisor and had earned a reputation for almost supernatural wisdom. Unlike other generals who relied purely on military tactics, Zhuge Liang understood that victory often depended on forces beyond the purely physical realm. As Cao Cao's forces approached the Yangtze, Zhuge Liang spent long hours studying ancient texts on astronomy, meteorology, and the movements of celestial bodies. The winter solstice was approaching, he realized, a time when the cosmic balance shifted dramatically. The positioning of the stars, the flow of the river, and the seasonal wind patterns were aligning in a way that happened perhaps once in a generation. Meanwhile, Cao Cao's army reached the northern banks of the Yangtze and began constructing a massive naval force. His engineers worked day and night, requisitioning every boat, barge, and fishing vessel for hundreds of miles around. Carpenters built new ships at a frantic pace, while blacksmiths forged weapons and armor specifically designed for naval combat. The sight was awe-inspiring. Thousands of vessels of junks bristling with catapults to simple every size and description, from massive war-fishing boats pressed into military service. But Cao Cao faced a fundamental size, was composed primarily of northern problem. His army, despite its overwhelming cavalrymen and foot soldiers who had never fought on water, the Yangtze was not some gentle but a mighty river over a mile wide in stream, to be forded on horseback, places with treacherous currents and unpredictable weather patterns. His men, accustomed to the solid ground of northern battlefields, found themselves queasy and disoriented on the rolling decks of ships. To compensate for this disadvantage, Cao Cao's engineers devised what seemed like a brilliant solution. They began chaining his ships together with massive iron links, creating floating platforms that would provide stability for his landlubber troops. The largest vessels were positioned in the center, with smaller craft arranged around them like the petals of an enormous flower. From a distance, the chained fleet looked invincible, a fortress of wood and iron that could weather any storm. Yet to the Feng Shui masters observing from the southern banks, this decision revealed a fatal flaw in Cao Cao's understanding of natural forces. By chaining his ships together, he had created not strength, but vulnerability. He had disrupted the natural flow of water around his vessels, creating stagnation where there should have been movement. In Feng Shui terms, he had built a dam across his own qi, trapping negative energy within his fleet. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of three armies, but the spiritual destiny of China itself. Ancient forces were stirring, wind patterns were shifting, and somewhere in the cosmic balance, a curse was taking shape that would soon unleash its fury upon the waters of the Yangtze. The Southern Alliance knew they faced impossible odds. Zhou, Sun Quan's brilliant naval commander, studied the enemy fleet through the morning mist and felt the weight of destiny pressing upon his shoulders. At 34 years old, he was considered one of the finest military minds in all of China, yet even his tactical genius seemed insufficient against such overwhelming numbers. The chained ships stretched across the river like a city built upon the water, their banners snapping in the winter wind. But Zhou possessed something Cao Cao lacked, an intimate understanding of the river itself. He had grown up along these waters, learning to read every current, every eddy, every subtle change in the wind's direction. The Yangtze was not merely a battlefield to him. It was a living entity with its own moods and temperaments, and he could sense that the great river was growing restless. As the two fleets faced each other across the dark waters, strange omens began to manifest. Fishermen reported seeing unusual cloud formations that resembled dragons locked in combat. Birds flew in patterns that defied explanation, circling the enemy fleet as if marking it for some terrible fate. The water itself seemed different, taking on an oily sheen that reflected the winter sun in unsettling ways. Zhuge Liang observed these signs with growing certainty that cosmic forces were aligning against Cao Cao. In the ancient Chinese understanding of the world, such omens were never random. They were messages from the heavens, warnings that the natural order was about to reassert itself with devastating force. The northern warlord, in his arrogance, had positioned his fleet in direct opposition to the flow of seasonal winds and the spiritual currents that governed this sacred waterway. The Feng Shui implications were staggering. Cao Cao had anchored his massive fleet at a bend in the river where the water naturally wanted to flow eastward toward the sea. By creating his chained fortress, he had forced the river to slow and pool around his vessels, creating what the ancient texts called dead water. In Feng Shui philosophy, stagnant water was the breeding ground for negative qi, a magnet for misfortune and disaster. More critically, the positioning violated every principle of harmonious placement. The fleet blocked the dragon lines, those invisible channels through which cosmic energy flowed across the landscape. Ancient Chinese generals knew to position their armies in harmony with these forces, not in opposition to them. Cao Cao's engineers, focused purely on military logistics, had inadvertently created a spiritual battleground where the very forces of nature would turn against them. As December deepened, the wind patterns began to shift in ways that local weather watchers found deeply unsettling. For generations beyond memory, winter winds along this stretch of the Yangtze had blown from the northwest, carrying the cold breath of the northern steppes down toward the warmer southern valleys. Ships positioned on the northern bank typically enjoyed the advantage of having the wind at their backs, pushing them toward their southern enemies. But now something was changing. The wind began to stutter and fail, dying to an eerie calm that left both fleets becalmed on waters smooth as polished bronze. Experienced sailors muttered nervously among themselves, recognizing signs they had heard about in old stories but never witnessed themselves. The river was holding its breath, they whispered, waiting for something momentous to occur. Zhuge Liang spent sleepless nights studying the ancient texts, cross-referencing astronomical charts with meteorological observations. The winter solstice was approaching, that pivotal moment when the cosmic balance would tip toward renewal and rebirth. But this year was different. The calculations revealed a rare celestial alignment, a configuration of stars and planets that occurred perhaps once in several decades. The implications were staggering. According to the most esoteric Feng Shui principles, such alignments could amplify natural forces to extraordinary levels. Wind patterns that normally shifted gradually over weeks could change in a matter of hours. Water currents that flowed predictably for generations could suddenly reverse direction. Most importantly, the spiritual energy that governed all natural phenomena could be redirected through proper ritual and understanding. Zhou recognized the opportunity that was presenting itself, though he understood the risks involved. If Zhuge Liang's calculations were correct, the approaching celestial event would create a window of supernatural possibility. But harnessing such forces required perfect timing and absolute faith in powers that existed beyond the realm of ordinary military strategy. The southern commanders began preparing for what they knew would be their only chance at victory. Traditional weapons would be useless against Cao Cao's overwhelming numbers and chained fortress. But fire, carried by shifting winds and fed by the dry winter timber of northern-built ships, could accomplish what no amount of conventional warfare could achieve. The plan was audacious beyond measure. A small fleet of vessels would be loaded with combustible materials and sail directly into the heart of Cao Cao's chained armada. The success of the attack would depend entirely on wind direction, and according to every natural law that governed this region, the winter winds should blow from the northwest, carrying any fire back toward the southern fleet. Yet Zhuge Liang insisted that the cosmic forces gathering around the winter solstice would reverse this pattern. At the precise moment of celestial alignment, he claimed, the winds would shift to blow from the southeast, carrying fire into the heart of the enemy fleet while sparing the southern attackers. It was a claim that seemed to defy both logic and meteorology, a bet on supernatural forces that could either deliver miraculous victory or catastrophic defeat. As the Southern Alliance made their final preparations, strange phenomena continued to manifest around both fleets. The water began to emit a phosphorescent glow at night, as if lit from within by ghostly flames. Fish died in massive numbers, floating belly up in patterns that resembled ancient Chinese characters when viewed from above. Most disturbing of all, soldiers on both sides reported dreams of a great dragon rising from the depths of the river, its eyes burning with supernatural fire. The Feng Shui masters interpreted these signs as clear evidence that the river itself had awakened, roused to anger by the disruption of its natural flow. The dragon of the Yangtze, they declared, was preparing to reclaim its domain from the foreign invaders who had dared to chain their vessels across its sacred waters. The final preparations began as the celestial alignment drew near. In the southern camps, priests and Feng Shui masters worked through the night, constructing ritual altars according to ancient specifications. These were not mere superstitions to the Chinese mind, but practical tools for channeling the invisible forces that governed wind and water. Incense burned continuously, sending prayers skyward while astronomers tracked the movement of stars with instruments passed down through generations of scholars. Huang Gai, a veteran general in Sun Quan's service, volunteered for what appeared to be a suicide mission. His weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, yet even this hardened warrior understood he was about to participate in something beyond ordinary warfare. The ships selected for the fire attack were loaded with oil-soaked timber, dried reeds, and sulfur compounds that would burn with intense heat. Hidden beneath these combustible materials were smaller boats that would allow the attackers to escape once the flames took hold. The psychological preparation was as crucial as the physical. Huang Gai sent messages to Cao Cao's camp, claiming he wished to defect from the Southern Alliance. Such defections were common as the balance of power shifted, and Cao Cao's intelligence officers found nothing suspicious in the veteran general's offer. The Northern Warlord, confident in his overwhelming superiority, welcomed another high-ranking enemy commander into his ranks. But as the appointed night approached, the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Soldiers on both sides reported an oppressive feeling, as if the atmosphere itself was charged with invisible energy. The water grew unnaturally still, reflecting the stars like a mirror. Not even the smallest ripple disturbed the surface, creating an eerie silence that made every whisper seem to echo across the river. Zhuge Liang stood upon a specially constructed altar, his robes whipping in winds that seemed to blow from all directions at once. For 3 days and nights, he had maintained his vigil, performing rituals that combined Taoist philosophy with practical meteorology. His calculations indicated that the celestial alignment would reach its peak at the 3rd hour after midnight, when the constellation of the Azure Dragon would pass directly overhead. The ancient texts spoke of such moments as cracks in the fabric of reality, times when the will of a learned practitioner could influence the fundamental forces of nature. But the cost of failure would be catastrophic. If the winds did not shift as predicted, Huang Gai's fire ships would burn their own fleet while leaving Cao Cao's chained fortress untouched. On the northern bank, Cao Cao himself grew uneasy as reports reached him of strange phenomena throughout his camp. Horses reared without cause, their eyes rolling white with terror. Guard fires flickered and danced, despite the still air. Most disturbing, several of his shamans and diviners had approached him with warnings that the spiritual energies surrounding their position were becoming dangerously unstable. Yet the Northern Warlord dismissed these concerns with the pragmatism that had carried him to power. He had built his empire through steel and strategy, not through mystical superstitions. His chained fleet was a masterpiece of engineering, each vessel locked to its neighbors by iron links strong enough to hold a mountain. Even if the Southern Alliance attempted some desperate attack, his floating fortress would absorb the impact like a stone wall. The irony was profound. In his determination to create an unbreakable formation, Cao Cao had unknowingly constructed the perfect trap for his own forces. The chains that provided stability in calm water would become instruments of doom if fire ever reached his fleet. Unable to maneuver independently, his ships would be forced to burn together, each vessel feeding the flames that consumed its neighbors. As midnight approached on the fateful night, the Southern Alliance moved into position with the silence of ghosts. Huang Gai's fire ships led the procession, followed by the main attack fleet that would exploit whatever chaos the flames created. Zhou commanded from his flagship, his eyes fixed on the enemy positions where thousands of torches created a constellation of lights across the dark water. The moment of truth arrived with startling suddenness. At precisely the hour Zhuge Liang had predicted, the oppressive stillness shattered as a wind rose from the southeast. It began as barely a whisper, stirring the banners and setting the water to gentle lapping. But within minutes, it strengthened to a steady breeze, then to a powerful gale that sent waves crashing against the hulls of both fleets. The reversal defied everything the northern soldiers understood about seasonal weather patterns. For generations, their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had told them that winter winds blew from the northwest, carrying the cold breath of the steppes toward the southern valleys. Yet now, impossibly, warm air rushed up from the south, as if the very earth had tilted on its axis. Huang Gai seized the moment with the instincts of a master tactician. His fire ships surged forward, their sails billowing with the supernatural wind as they raced toward Cao Cao's chained fleet. The distance closed with terrifying speed, and soon the northern sentries could make out the approaching vessels in the darkness. The deception held until the final moments. Believing they were witnessing the arrival of a defecting general, Cao Cao's men prepared to welcome the approaching ships with cheers and torches. Only when Huang Gai's vessels burst into flames did they realize the true nature of the attack. The fire ships struck Cao Cao's fleet like meteors falling from heaven. The carefully prepared combustibles exploded into infernos that reached hundreds of feet into the night sky, turning darkness into blazing day. The wind, still blowing strong from the southeast, caught the flames and hurled them across the chained vessels with supernatural fury. What happened next would be remembered for millennia as one of history's most devastating naval disasters. The iron chains that were meant to provide strength became instruments of destruction, preventing the burning ships from drifting apart. Fire leaped from vessel to vessel with hungry eagerness, consuming everything in its path. The dry timber of northern-built ships, seasoned by months of winter cold, burned like tinder. Cao Cao's soldiers found themselves trapped in a floating hell. Those who leaped into the water to escape the flames discovered that the river itself seemed to burn, oil and pitch spreading across the surface in sheets of fire. The screams of dying men mixed with the roar of the Inferno, creating a symphony of destruction that could be heard for miles. The feng shui implications were unmistakable to those who understood such matters. The dragon of the Yangtze had indeed awakened, and its fury was terrible to behold. The stagnant qi that had built up around Cao Cao's fleet exploded outward in a purifying conflagration, cleansing the river of the spiritual pollution that had accumulated there. From the southern bank, Zhou launched his main assault as the enemy fleet dissolved into chaos. His war junks cut through the smoke and flame like sharks sensing blood, targeting the few northern vessels that had escaped the initial conflagration. The battle became a rout as Cao Cao's demoralized forces, having witnessed what seemed like divine intervention, lost all will to fight. The northern warlord himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing north with the remnants of his once mighty army. Behind him, the Yangtze burned throughout the night, a river of fire that seemed to reach toward the very stars themselves. The cosmic balance had been restored, the natural order reasserted through forces beyond mortal understanding. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins of Cao Cao's fleet, the Southern Alliance stood victorious on waters that had been cleansed by supernatural fire. The Battle of Red Cliffs was over, but its consequences would reshape the destiny of China for generations to come. The victory at Red Cliffs sent shockwaves through every corner of the fractured empire. News of the impossible defeat spread faster than wildfire, carried by merchants, refugees, and deserting soldiers who had witnessed the supernatural flames with their own eyes. In tea houses and marketplaces from the northern steppes to the southern ports, people whispered of dragons rising from the depths and winds that obeyed the commands of mortal men. Yet the true magnitude of what had occurred went far deeper than mere military conquest. The battle had shattered more than ships and armies. It had broken the myth of Cao Cao's invincibility, the carefully constructed legend that had allowed him to absorb rival after rival through fear alone. Now that aura of unstoppable power lay in ashes on the bottom of the Yangtze, and ambitious generals throughout the empire began sharpening their swords. The feng shui masters who had witnessed the conflagration understood they had participated in something unprecedented. Never before had the cosmic forces responded so dramatically to human ritual and calculation. Zhuge Liang's ability to read the celestial signs and channel them into devastating military advantage established him as perhaps the greatest strategist of his age. His reputation for supernatural wisdom spread throughout the land, growing with each telling until he became as much legend as man. But the curse of Red Cliffs extended beyond the immediate aftermath. Cao Cao's defeat had torn open the fabric of Chinese unity, creating wounds that would fester for generations. The empire that had stood as one for centuries now fragmented into three distinct kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy while viewing the others as usurpers. The age of division had begun, an era where brother would fight brother and the land would know no peace. In the years that followed, armies would clash again and again across the bloodied soil of China. Heroes would rise and fall, alliances would form and shatter, and the dream of reunification would remain tantalizingly out of reach. Some say the dragon of the Yangtze, once awakened by the disruption of cosmic harmony, refused to slumber again until the natural order was fully restored. The Battle of Red Cliffs had proven that in ancient China, victory belonged not always to the strongest, but to those who understood the invisible forces that shaped the world. Wind and water, star and stone, the movement of qi through dragon lines carved into the very bones of the earth. These were the weapons that had decided an empire's fate, wielded by minds that perceived connections between heaven and earth that escaped ordinary understanding. And so the fires that consumed Cao Cao's fleet did more than burn wood and iron. They ignited a transformation that would echo through the corridors of history for over a millennium. The Battle of Red Cliffs stands as perhaps the most dramatic example of how ancient Chinese understanding of cosmic forces could shape the destiny of empires. What began as a clash between armies became a demonstration that the universe itself had chosen sides. The wind that shifted against all natural law, the flames that danced with supernatural fury, the perfect timing of celestial alignment. These were not mere coincidences, but evidence of a deeper truth that the ancients understood far better than we might imagine today. The Feng Shui curse of Red Cliffs reminds us that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not forged of steel, but drawn from the invisible currents that flow through wind and water, earth and sky. In a world where we often dismiss such beliefs as primitive superstition, perhaps we should pause and wonder what forces we ourselves might be ignoring. The next time you feel the wind change direction unexpectedly, or notice how certain places seem to carry an energy all their own, remember the lesson of the Yangtze. Sometimes the universe is trying to tell us something. The question is whether we possess the wisdom to listen and the courage to act when the cosmic tides begin to turn. On a storm-lashed afternoon in 1543, the winds of history carry, and more than just rained thunder to the shores of Japan. Three Portuguese adventurers, clinging to the deck of a battered Chinese junk, watched as an unfamiliar coastline emerged from the tempest. In their weathered hands, they carried objects that would shatter 1,000 years of tradition and forever change the soul of the samurai. These were not mere travelers seeking shelter from the storm. They were the harbingers of a revolution that would echo across centuries, transforming the very essence of warfare in the land of the rising Sunday. The island of Nagashino stretched before them like a forgotten jewel in the vast Pacific. Its beaches, untouched by foreign footsteps, would soon become the stage for an encounter that neither East nor West could have imagined. The Portuguese clutched their matchlock firearms close, unaware that these simple weapons would ignite a technological wildfire that would consume the old ways of war and birth a new age of conflict. This is the story of how three strangers with thunder in their hands shocked an empire and changed the course of history forever. The year 1543 found Japan drowning in chaos. The once mighty Ashikaga shogunate had crumbled into a phantom of its former glory, leaving behind a fractured archipelago where warlords carved up territories like wolves dividing a carcass. This was the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, where loyalty was currency and betrayal was commonplace. Across the islands, castle walls rose and fell with the seasons, and the clash mountain of steel echoed from passes to coastal plains. Into this world of endless conflict, of honor still the concept held sacred meaning. The Sam warriors Bunurai, those elated by the code of Bushido, dominate sharp-cut the battlefield with their razorana and their mastery of the bow. For generations, warfare art had been in form, a deadly dance between mounted warriors who measured their worth in single combat and personal valor. Theoves, the whist thunder of Hotel, thread the ring of blade of arrows, and against blade was symphony of Japanese warfare. Yet beneath this romantic veneer of honor and tradition lay a harsh reality. The constant warfare had bled the land dry. Villages burned, crops withered, and the common people lived in terror of roving bands of soldiers. The feudal system that had once brought order now only seemed to breed chaos. Regional daimyo, the powerful lords who ruled their domains like independent kingdoms, schemed and plotted against one another with ruthless am. The Portuguese who arrived that fateful day were not con the traditional sense. They were merchants in and adventurers, driven by the forces of profit, twin, and curiosity that had already them across half-carry the world. Their black-hulled ships, painted with pitch to protect against the hungry sea worms of tropical waters, had become a sight in familiar the ports of Asia Goa to Mac. Fromau, the Portuguese had established a network of trading posts that stretched like chain, a golden across the Indian Ocean. But Japan different was. Japan was close isolated, a world unto itself that had turned its back on foreign influence for centuries. The arrival of these weather-beaten strangers represented more than just another trading opportunity. It was the collision of two worlds, two philosopheries of, two ways of understanding power itself. Lorigashima Tokitaka, ruler of the island where the Portuguese made landfall, was a man caught between curiosity and caution. When he first laid eyes upon the foreign weapons that the Portuguese carried, he saw not just tools of war, but windows into a different understanding of conflict itself. These, with their matchlock firearms and mechanisms and their ability to spit fire and death across great distances, defied everything he understood about combat. The demonstration that followed would become the stuff of legend. The Portuguese, eager to impress their host and perhaps secure favorable trading terms, powdered their weapons and shot. The matchlock mechanism, a marvel of European engineering, held a length of smoldering rope soaked in saltpeter. When triggered, this burning match would fall into a pan of gunpowder, igniting the charge in the barrel and sending a lead ball screaming toward its target. The thunderous roar that erupted from the weapon shattered the afternoon calm like a physical blow. Birds exploded from the trees in panic, and the Japanese observers stepped back in awe and terror. The smoke that billowed to carried from the barrel seemed with it the breath of dragons of the shot, and the accuracy, striking its target with deadly precision at a distance that the finest challenge, even archer, spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension. Tokitaka's reaction was, and decisive. Within swift hours, he had negotiated the purchase of both, paying a weapons, some equippy that would have a small army with traditional weapons. But the true price of this transaction would be measured not in gold, but in the transformation it would unleash upon Japanese society. The Lord immediately summoned his finest swordsmiths and craftsmen, men whose families had forged blades for generations, whose understanding legendary of metal throughout. Was and fire the island's Yaita Kinbi Kiyosada, master of his craft, was tasked with the impossible challenge seemingly of reproducing these foreign departe weapons. The Portuguese had with the tied firearms, leaving behind only the two, and the memory of their devastating power followed, was a masterclass in Japanese ingenuity and determination. Kiyosada and his apprentices dismantled the weapons with the reverence of scholars examining sacred texts. Every component was measured, weighed, and studied. The barrel, the trigger mechanism, the serpentine that held the burning match, all became subjects of intense scrutiny and experimentation. Yet one element proved frustratingly elusive. The screw mechanism that secured the breech of the weapon required a helical drilling technique that was unknown in Japan. For months, the smiths struggled with this challenge, producing weapon after weapon that functioned well in every aspect except this crucial detail. The barrels would not hold pressure, would not seal the mechanisms properly, and the weapons remained dangerous to their users as well as their targets. The solution, when it finally came, arrived bonded wrapped in the of matrimony and cultural exchange. When Portuguese traders returned to Nagashino the following year, they brought with them a blacksmith hosed, tells us knowledge of metal craftsmanship. Legendergy complimented Japanese that this foreign artisan married daughter of Ad, the local smith, and in the intimate exchange of knowledge between cultures, the secret of helical drilling was revealed. Within a decade was complete. Japanese First Thunder Thatap on CL to Nagashino Beach. The transformation workshops were producing firearms by the thousands, each weapon bearing the mark of local innovation and improvement. The Tanegashima, as these weapons came to be known, were no longer crude copies of Portuguese originals. They had become uniquely Japanese instruments of war, refined and perfected by craftsmen who understood that survival in the Sengoku period demanded the embrace of every advantage. The speed of this transformation was breathtaking. Conservative estimates suggest that within 10 years, over 300,000 firearms had been manufactured across Japan. The island nation that had been isolated from global military developments for centuries had not only adopted foreign technology, but had begun to surpass its originators in both quantity and quality of production. The workshops Japan blazed day and night with the fury of creation. From the mountain villages of Fonshu to the coastal towns of Kyushu, the sounding of ham metal replaced the ancient rhythm of sword forging. Master craftsmen who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the katana now bent their skills to toa, different kind of blade, one that spoke in thunder rather than whispered in steel. The ashigaru, the foot soldiers who had long served as mere support for the mounted samurai elite, suddenly found themselves wielding power that could humble the mightiest warrior. A farmer's son with a Tanegashima could now face down a samurai law family who had trained for generations in the arts of war. The weapon required no decades of practice, no intimate understanding of balance and timing that came only through years of dedication. Point, aim, pull the trigger, and watch as tradition crumbled before progress. This democratization of death sent tremors through the rigid hierarchy of Japanese, whose society, the samurai class' very identity, was built upon their monopoly of martial skill, watched in alarm growing as their carefully maintained advantages evaporated like morning mist. The way of the warrior, the sacred Bushido that had defined their existence for centuries, seemed suddenly antiquated in the face of these roaring dragons of war. Yet the more pragmatic among the daimyo recognized opportunity where others saw only threat. Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, whose cavalry charges had become legend across the warring states, issued a proclamation that would echo through history. In the year 1567, he declared that firearms would henceforth be the most important weapons in his arsenal, ordering his commanders to reduce the number of traditional spearmen and arm their finest with guns soldiers. From the mouth instia of one of Japan's most respected military leaders, this was nothing of revolutionary short. The tactical implications spread like wildfire through the military minds of the era. Oda Nobunaga, the demon lord whose ambitions stretched beyond any, began single provincenting with formations that would maximize the devastating potential of massed firearms. His enemies watched in horror as rank upon rank of ashigaru Sekigahara loaded forward, their tanned and ready, transforming warfare from an art of individual hero destruction. The holism into a science of collective ways died hard. Many samurai continued to charge battle with nothing into but steel and courage, believing while that the ancient verted triumph over foreign. Their innovations learned, often fatally, that honor provided little protection against lead balls traveling high velocity at let. The battlefield became a teacher more ruthless than any master of arms, and its lessons word. Castle architects scram fortifications to this build to adapt their ancient new reality. Walls that had stood for generations against siege engine scaling and ladders now crumbled before concentrated gunfire. The high that had once provided towers armies became commanding views of approaching death traps when faced with accurate marksmen. The very geography of warfare was being rewritten by the thunderous voice of gunpowder. Innovation bred innovation. Japanese craftsmen, never content to simply copy, began developing improvements that surpassed their Portuguese models. They created larger calibers for greater stopping power, devised protective lacquerware covers that firing allow in rain, and developed measured string systems for accurate night shooting. The students had become the masters, pushing the technology teachers had ever there beyond what epogumi, the specialize, imagined. The T-units that began gun appearing in every major army represented more than just tactical evolution. They died a fundamental embo shift in how warfare was conceived and conducted. No longer was battle a series of individual duels between noble warriors. It had become an industrial process, a methodical application of coordinated firepower that could sweep away centuries of martial tradition in a matter of minutes. Training regimens transformed across the islands, where once young men had spent years learning the intricate forms of swordsmanship. Now they drilled endlessly in the mechanical motions of loading, aiming, and firing. The meditation and spiritual preparation that had been central to samurai combative muscle gave way to repet mathematical memory and precision. War was becoming a craft rather than an art. The psychological impact proved as devastating. The row as the physicler of massed firearms, the billowing clouds of acrid smoke, the sight of mounted samurai toppling from invisible by their horses struck death, all combined to create a new kind of terror on the battlefield. The very itself seemed to become an enemy, filled with whistling projectiles and the scred. Economicums of the wound structures shifted to support this new reality. Merchant families like Tachibanaya clan that recognized the to-be-made in immense profits, firearms, production and trade. What had begun as a military necessity evolved into a thriving industry, with specialized workshops competing to produce the finest Tanegashima. The tools of war had become the engines of commerce. Religious institutions found themselves drawn into the transformation. The warrior monks of Mount Nagoro, who had long defended their temples with traditional weapons, became unexpected pioneers in firearms training and production. Their disciplined communities proved ideal for the systematic approach that gunpowder warfare demanded, and their workshops' instruction became centers of innovation, and the ripples spread beyond the immediate military sphere. Diplomatic relationships shifted as daimyo sought alliances with those who possessed superior firearms technology. Trade routes realigned to accommodate the flow of saltpeter, lead, and other materials essential for ammunition production. The entire fabric of Japanese society was being rewoven around this of foreign new three-year innovation. Regional variations emerged as different domains adapted the technology to their specific needs and circumstances. Mountain clans developed lighter weapons suited for difficult terrain, while coastal lords favored heavier pieces capable of defending harbors against naval assault. Each adaptation represented not just tactical thinking, but cultural interpretation of how foreign this gift should be employed. The generation warriors of coming of age in this transformed landscape found themselves caught between worlds. They inherited traditions the prue of their ancestors, while being forced to master technologies that rendered those traditions obsolete. Some embraced the change with enthusiasm, seeing opportunity where their elders saw only loss-lung despair. Others see that it lead to the old ways, hoping valor and skill could still triumph over mechanical precision. The transformation was not merely technological but profoundly spiritual. In the sacred halls where samurai had once meditated upon death before battle, now arose the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of lead. The rituals of purification that had preceded combat for centuries seemed suddenly hollow when faced with weapons that killed from distances where honor could not be seen or acknowledged. The very soul of warfare was being rewritten by foreign hands. Training grounds across Japan echoed with new sounds. Where once the rhythmic clash of wooden practice swords had marked, now came the sharp, the passing hour's crack of matchlock firing and the shouted commands of drill instructors. Young men who might have spent years perfecting the 8 cuts of the katana instead learned to load, prime, and fire with mechanical precision. The poetry of swordplay gave way to the mathematics of ballistics. Oda Nobunaga watched these developments with the calculating eye of a predator sensing opportunity. Unlike his more traditional rivals, he saw in firearms not just another weapon but the key to absolute dominance. His spies reported on every workshop, every innovation, every tactical experiment conducted by his enemies. In his castle halls, he gathered around him not just warriors but merchants, craftsmen, and foreign advisors who understood the new mathematics of war. The Demon Lord's vision extended beyond mere acquisition of weapons. He began to restructure his entire military philosophy around the coordinated use of massed firepower. His engineers worked feverishly on portable wooden barriers that could be quickly assembled to protect his gunners. His quartermasters calculated the enormous quantities of gunpowder and shot required to sustain prolonged engagements. Every aspect of his military machine bent toward maximizing the potential of these thunderous weapons. Other daimyo struggled to adapt to the new reality. The Imagawa clan, proud inheritors of ancient martial traditions, found their elaborate battle formations crumbling before coordinated volleys. Their mounted samurai, resplendent in ancestral armor, discovered that courage provided no shield against lead balls traveling at lethal velocity. The battlefield had become a place where birth and breeding meant less than tactical innovation and industrial capacity. Castle sieges transformed from of honor into exercises of fairs in applied engineering. The high walls that had protected Japanese fortresses for generations proved vulnerable to concentrated artillery fire. Defenders who had once relied on arrows and boiling oil now faced enemies who could breach their defenses from distances that rendered traditional countermeasures useless. The architecture of war was evolving as rapidly as its weapons. Innovation bred further innovation in an accelerating spiral of military development. Japanese craftsmen, never content with mere imitation, pushed their Portuguese models to new extremes. They experimented with different bore sizes, seeking the perfect balance between power and portability. Master metalworkers developed new alloys that could withstand the tremendous pressures generated by exploding gunpowder. Each improvement represented not just technical advancement, but cultural adaptation. The social implications rippled through every level of Japanese society. Merchant families who had previously supplied swords and arrows now invested heavily in gunpowder production facilities. Farmers found themselves conscripted not just as laborers, but as potential soldiers, whose effectiveness depended more on discipline than hereditary skill. The rigid hierarchies that had defined Japanese civilization for centuries began to blur under the democratizing influence of firearm technology. Regional variations emerged as different domains adapted the new weapons to their specific geographic and tactical needs. Mountain clans developed lightweight firearms suited for ambush warfare in difficult terrain. Coastal lords invested in heavier pieces capable of defending harbors against naval assault. Island communities created specialized ammunition designed to penetrate the thick hulls of enemy vessels. Each adaptation reflected local innovation and strategic thinking. The warrior monks of various temples found themselves at the forefront of firearms development. Their disciplined communities and substantial resources made them natural centers for experimentation and production. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that these men of peace had become pioneers in the arts of mechanized destruction. Their workshops hummed with activity as they sought to perfect both the spiritual and practical aspects of their deadly craft. Training methods evolved to match the new weapons. Where samurai education had once emphasized individual excellence and spiritual preparation, military schools now focused on coordinated group tactics and mechanical precision. Young warriors learned to move in formation, to load and fire in synchronized volleys, to maintain their weapons under battlefield conditions. The lone hero gave way to the disciplined unit. Economic structures shifted to support the new military reality. Supply chains developed to provide the enormous quantities of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur required for gunpowder production. Lead mines operated at unprecedented capacity to meet the demand for ammunition. International trade relationships formed around the importation of materials unavailable in Japan. The tools of war had become the engines of economic transformation. The psychological impact of firearms warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. Civilian populations who had previously witnessed combat as a series of individual duels between armored warriors now cowered before the thunderous roar of massed volleys. The smoke and noise of gunpowder warfare created an atmosphere of terror that traditional weapons could never match. Fear itself had become a weapon of war. Diplomatic relationships realigned as daimyo sought alliances with those possessing superior firearms technology. Marriage negotiations now included discussions of weapon-sharing agreements. Trade treaties incorporated clauses regarding ammunition supplies. The balance of power across Japan shifted not just according to traditional measures of strength, but based on access to and mastery of the new military technologies. Cultural resistance emerged alongside military adoption. Conservative elements within the samurai class viewed firearms as fundamentally dishonorable weapons that reduced warfare to mere mechanical slaughter. They argued that true warriors should face their enemies with blade in hand, not hide behind clouds of smoke and mechanical devices. This tension between tradition and innovation would define Japanese military culture for generations to come. The generation coming of age during this transformation found themselves caught between worlds. They inherited the proud traditions of their ancestors, while being forced to master technologies that rendered those traditions obsolete. Some embraced the change enthusiastically, seeing in firearms the path to military success and social advancement. Others clung desperately to the old ways, hoping that individual skill and spiritual preparation could still triumph over mechanical precision. Regional commanders began experimenting with combined arms tactics that integrated traditional weapons with firearms. Spearmen learned to work in coordination with arquebusiers, providing protection while the gunners reloaded. Cavalry adapted their charges to take advantage of gaps created by coordinated volleys. Archers found new roles in suppressing enemy gunners and exploiting the smoke-filled confusion of firearms battles. The art of war was being completely reimagined. The influence spread beyond purely military applications. Craftsmen applied metalworking techniques developed for firearms to other industries. The precision required for manufacturing gun barrels improved the quality of agricultural tools and construction implements. Knowledge gained from studying gunpowder chemistry advanced mining and road construction techniques. The technological revolution initiated by 3 Portuguese adventurers was transforming Japanese society at every level. Castle design evolved rapidly to address the new threats. Architects developed lower, thicker walls capable of withstanding artillery bombardment. Star-shaped fortifications began appearing, designed according to European principles, but adapted to Japanese materials and construction techniques. The ancient art of defensive architecture was being revolutionized by offensive innovations that had arrived from across the sea just decades earlier. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test all these innovations against the traditional might of Japan's most formidable military force. In the mountains of central Japan, the Takeda clan's legendary cavalry prepared for battles that would determine whether the old ways of war could survive against the thunderous voice of progress. The revolution that began with 3 strangers on a storm-swept beach was about to reach its climactic moment. The winds of change that had swept across Japan for 3 decades would soon converge on a single battlefield where tradition and innovation would clash with devastating finality. In the year 1575, as summer heat shimmered across the plains of central Japan, 2 armies approached each other with destinies intertwined by the thunder that had first echoed from Tanegashima's shores. The Takeda clan, masters of mounted warfare whose cavalry charges had become the stuff of legend, rode toward their appointment with history. Opposing them stood the forces of Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu, their ranks bristling with the foreign weapons that had transformed the very soul of Japanese warfare. The fortress of Nagashino stood like a sentinel between these 2 worlds. Its walls had witnessed the old ways of siege and storm, but now they would become the stage for something unprecedented. Behind wooden palisades hastily constructed along the river's edge, 3,000 arquebus-armed ashigaru waited in disciplined silence. These were not the individual warriors of tradition, but components of a military machine designed to deliver coordinated destruction. Their weapons loaded, their matches glowing. They represented the culmination of the revolution that had begun with Portuguese curiosity and Japanese ingenuity. Takeda Katsuyori, inheritor of his father's legendary reputation but not his wisdom, gazed across the field with the confidence of generations. His 15,000 warriors, including the finest heavy cavalry in Japan, had never known defeat. The sight of peasant foot soldiers hiding behind wooden barriers seemed almost insulting to men who had carved their names in glory through personal valor and mounted charges. How could farmers with foreign tubes of metal stand against the thundering might of the Takeda horsemen? The morning mist clung to the Rengogawa River as both armies took their positions. On the Takeda side, banners fluttered in the breeze bearing the ancient symbols of noble houses. Mounted samurai in elaborate armor checked their weapons and whispered prayers to their ancestors. Their horses stamped impatiently, sensing the tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. This was warfare as it had been conducted for centuries. a dance of honor between warriors who knew each other's names and respected each other's courage. The thunder that first echoed across Tanegashima Beach had spoken its final word. In the space of 3 decades, 3 Portuguese strangers with curious weapons had unleashed forces that would reshape an empire. The samurai's sacred world of steel and honor lay shattered beneath the smoke of 1,000 Tanegashima, and from its ashes rose a new Japan where tradition bowed before innovation. The black ships had brought more than trade goods and foreign faces. They had carried the seeds of revolution that would bloom in gunpowder and blood, forever changing the soul of a warrior nation. In the scorching heat of a June afternoon in 1560, thunder rolled across the hills of central Japan. But this was not the rumble of an approaching storm. This was the sound of 25,000 warriors marching toward what they believed would be their destiny. At their head rode Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful warlords in all of Japan, his banners streaming in the wind, his armor glinting like gold in the summer Sunday. He commanded an army so vast that observers claimed it stretched beyond the horizon. His goal was nothing less than the conquest of the entire nation. Standing in his path was a young upstart named Oda Nobunaga, dismissed by his own people as the great fool of Owari. With barely 3,000 men, outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, facing certain annihilation against one of Japan's mightiest forces, every military expert of the time predicted his swift and brutal defeat. Yet what happened next would send shockwaves across the entire archipelago and change the course of Japanese history forever. This is the story of the Battle of Okehazama, where the impossible became reality, where a single afternoon shattered the dreams of empire and forged the legend of the man who would unite Japan under one banner. It was a clash that would prove that in the brutal world of the samurai, victory belonged not to the largest army, but to the boldest heart. The year 1560 found Japan drowning in chaos. For over a century, the island nation had been consumed by the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, where regional warlords battled endlessly for supremacy, while the once mighty Ashikaga shogunate crumbled into irrelevance. Villages burned, families were torn apart, and the very fabric of society seemed to be unraveling. In this fractured landscape of constant warfare, power belonged to those strong enough to seize it and cunning enough to hold it. Among the most formidable of these warlords was Imagawa Yoshimoto, master of 3 provinces and commander of one of the most disciplined armies in Japan. From his stronghold in Suruga, he had spent decades carefully building his power through strategic alliances and calculated conquests. By 1560, he controlled vast territories along the crucial Tokaido Road, the lifeline connecting eastern and western Japan. His domain stretched across fertile valleys and busy trade routes, generating the wealth needed to maintain his massive military machine. Yoshimoto was no mere brute warrior. He was a cultured man, a poet who appreciated the finer things in life, yet beneath his refined exterior burned the ambition of a conqueror. He had forged the powerful Koso-Sun alliance, uniting his forces with the Takeda clan of Kai and the Hojo clan of Sagami, creating a confederation that dominated eastern Japan. With this alliance secured, Yoshimoto turned his gaze westward toward the ultimate prize, the imperial capital of Kyoto and the right to rule all of Japan. The path to Kyoto led through Owari province, a relatively small domain wedged between the mountains and the sea. Here ruled a man many considered utterly unfit for leadership. Oda Nobunaga, the second son of a minor deputy governor, had earned the mocking title of the Great Fool of Owari through his outrageous behavior and apparent disregard for tradition. While other young nobles practiced calligraphy and studied poetry, Nobunaga could be found consorting with merchants and common soldiers, learning their trades and understanding their concerns. When his father died in 1551, leaving him the inheritance at just 17 years old, many expected the Oda clan to collapse within months. Nobunaga's own relatives challenged his authority, viewing him as weak and inexperienced. Yet, through a combination of ruthless determination and unconventional tactics, the young lord had systematically eliminated his rivals. By 1560, he had finally consolidated control over his domain, but his forces remained pitifully small compared to the giants surrounding him. As spring turned to summer in 1560, Yoshimoto's preparations for his grand campaign reached their climax. From across his 3 provinces, warriors converged on his banner. Mounted samurai in gleaming armor, disciplined ashigaru foot soldiers with their long spears, and skilled archers with their deadly accurate bows. Supply trains stretched for miles, carrying rice, weapons, and siege equipment. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of this massive host as it began its westward march. Yoshimoto deliberately spread word that his army numbered 40,000 men, a psychological tactic designed to terrify potential opponents into submission without a fight. The truth was impressive enough. Over 25,000 battle-hardened warriors, veterans of countless campaigns, united under the command of one of Japan's most experienced generals. As news of the approaching army spread, panic swept through the smaller domains in its path. Most local lords wisely chose submission over annihilation. The strategic situation was crystal clear to any military observer. Yoshimoto's route would take him directly through Owari province, where the upstart Nobunaga waited with his laughably small force. The smart money was on Nobunaga, fleeing to his castle at Kiyosu, and hoping the walls would hold long enough for him to negotiate favorable surrender terms. No sane commander would consider facing such overwhelming odds in open battle. Yet as reports reached Nobunaga of the Imagawa advance, his response shocked even his closest advisors. Rather than preparing for a siege or seeking terms for surrender, he began planning an attack. His senior retainers pleaded with him to see reason. They pointed to the impossible mathematics of the situation, the certain destruction that awaited them, the wisdom of living to fight another day. But Nobunaga had made his decision with the cold calculation that would define his career. He understood something his advisors did not. Kiyosu Castle, impressive as it appeared, could not withstand a prolonged siege by such a massive force. Surrender would mean the end of the Oda clan and his own execution. Flight would only delay the inevitable. If he was going to die, he would die on his own terms, taking as many enemies with him as possible. But more than that, Nobunaga sensed an opportunity that others could not see. Large armies moved slowly, required constant supplies, and often grew overconfident in their own power. As Yoshimoto's forces crossed into Owari territory in early June, they encountered their first resistance at the border fortresses of Washizu and Marun. These small castles, garrisoned by handfuls of Oda retainers, stood no chance against the Imagawa juggernaut. Yet their defenders fought with desperate courage, forcing Yoshimoto to deploy significant portions of his army and expend precious time reducing these obstacles. What should have been simple mopping-up operations became prolonged affairs that slowed the advance and began to fray tempers in the Imagawa ranks. The fall of these border fortresses sent a clear message throughout Owari. The storm was coming, and nothing could stop it. Villages emptied as civilians fled westward, carrying what possessions they could. Smoke rose from burning fields as retreating defenders implemented scorched earth tactics, denying supplies to the invaders. The roads became clogged with refugees, their faces etched with the terror of those who had seen war's true face. In Kiyosu Castle, Nobunaga's war council convened for what many believed would be their final meeting. Around the low table sat the cream of Owari's military leadership, men who had served the Oda family for generations. Their faces were grim as they contemplated the approaching catastrophe. Scout reports confirmed their worst fears. The Imagawa army was enormous, well-equipped, and commanded by generals with decades of experience. Against such a force, their small domain seemed as fragile as rice paper in a typhoon. Yet, as the debate raged around him, Nobunaga remained eerily calm. While his retainers argued about defensive positions and supply lines, he studied maps and questioned every scout personally about the enemy's movements and dispositions. He wanted to know not just where Yoshimoto was going, but how he was getting there, where he rested, how his men were deployed. Information, Nobunaga had learned, was often more valuable than steel. The geography of the approaching battle zone was intimately familiar to Nobunaga and his men. For years, they had used these hills and valleys for hunting expeditions and military exercises. Every stream, every ridge, every hidden path was known to them. This local knowledge would prove more precious than gold in the hours to come. As Yoshimoto's massive army drew closer to the heart of Owari, confident in their overwhelming strength, They marched unknowingly toward an appointment with destiny that would echo through the centuries. The morning of June 19th brought disturbing news to Yoshimoto's camp. His advance scouts reported that Nobunaga had abandoned the obvious defensive strategy. Instead of retreating to Kyosu Castle as expected, the Oda forces were moving eastward, directly toward the Imagawa positions. This intelligence puzzled Yoshimoto's commanders. Was the fool of Owari truly planning to attack their vastly superior army? The very notion seemed so absurd that many dismissed it as a desperate bluff or a feint designed to mask Nobunaga's true intentions. Yoshimoto himself received this news with a mixture of amusement and contempt. He had expected Nobunaga to cower behind castle walls, perhaps sending envoys to negotiate terms of surrender. The idea that this upstart would dare challenge the might of the Imagawa on the open field struck him as the final proof of Nobunaga's legendary foolishness. If the young lord wished to throw away his life and his clan's future in a single reckless gesture, so be it. The battle would be over before the sun reached its zenith. As the Imagawa host resumed its westward march, the mood among the ranks was one of confident anticipation. Veterans shared stories of past victories, while new recruits eagerly awaited their first taste of glory. The supply trains rumbled along behind the main force, carrying not just weapons and provisions, but also the ceremonial gear Yoshimoto would need for his triumphal entry into Kyoto. Banners fluttered in the warm breeze, displaying the proud crests of dozens of samurai families. This was not merely an army on the march. It was the visible manifestation of a new order preparing to sweep across Japan. Yet beneath this veneer of confidence, subtle signs of strain were beginning to show. The prolonged siege of the border fortresses had cost more time than anticipated. Supply lines stretched thin as the massive army consumed vast quantities of rice and fodder daily. The June heat was brutal, and many soldiers had begun to shed pieces of their armor to stay comfortable during the long march. Discipline, while still strong, had relaxed somewhat as victory seemed assured, and the enemy appeared to be fleeing rather than fighting. Meanwhile, in the Oda ranks, a very different mood prevailed. Nobunaga had spent the previous evening addressing his men, not with grand speeches about honor and glory, but with cold, practical assessments of their situation. He reminded them that they faced annihilation if they remained passive, but that bold action might yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction. This was not a man seeking a glorious death, but a commander who genuinely believed he could win. The dawn of June 20th found Nobunaga rising before his men, consuming a simple meal of rice while standing, his movements quick and purposeful. He had chosen his attire carefully, donning armor that was functional rather than ornate, designed for combat rather than ceremony. Before departing Kyosu, he paused at the castle's shrine, reciting a passage from the ancient song Atsumori that spoke of life's fleeting nature. It was a moment of quiet contemplation before the storm. His force was pitifully small by the standards of the age, barely 3,000 men, many of them ashigaru foot soldiers rather than mounted samurai. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in intimate knowledge of the terrain and absolute faith in their leader. These were not reluctant conscripts dragged from their fields, but professional soldiers who had chosen to follow Nobunaga despite the odds. They moved with the quiet efficiency of men who knew their business and trusted their commander's judgment. The route Nobunaga chose took his army along familiar paths through the hills south of the main Tokaido road. His men moved in small groups to avoid detection, using valleys and forest cover to mask their approach. This was not the grand procession of a traditional samurai army, but the swift advance of hunters stalking dangerous prey. Scouts ranged ahead, bringing back constant reports on Imagawa positions and movements. Every piece of information was analyzed and incorporated into Nobunaga's evolving battle plan. As the Oda forces approached their objective, Nobunaga made a decision that revealed both his tactical brilliance and his understanding of psychological warfare. Rather than hiding his presence, he ordered his men to establish a temporary camp near the fortified temple of Zenshoji, clearly visible to any Imagawa scouts in the area. But this was no ordinary encampment. His soldiers planted dozens of banners and standards around the temple grounds, creating the illusion of a much larger force. From a distance, The forest of flags suggested that Nobunaga had somehow assembled an army capable of challenging the Imagawa on equal terms. This deception served multiple purposes. It would confuse enemy intelligence about Oda's strength and dispositions. It might cause Yoshimoto to deploy his forces more cautiously than necessary. Most importantly, it demonstrated to Nobunaga's own men that their leader was thinking several moves ahead, using cunning and misdirection to level the playing field. The great fool of Owari was revealing himself to be anything but foolish. The Imagawa scouts who observed this display carried their reports back to Yoshimoto's headquarters with growing concern. The enemy force appeared larger than expected, and its positioning suggested tactical sophistication rather than desperate panic. For the first time since beginning his march, Yoshimoto found himself forced to consider that this battle might not be the simple massacre he had anticipated. Yet his confidence remained unshaken. Even if Nobunaga had managed to assemble 5,000 men, the numerical advantage still lay overwhelmingly with the Imagawa. As the afternoon of June 20th wore on, both armies maneuvered toward their chosen positions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of two clans, but the future direction of Japanese history. In the hills around Okehazama, ancient forces were converging. Tradition against innovation, overwhelming strength against desperate cunning, the established order against the chaos of change. Yoshimoto established his main camp in a narrow valley called Okehazama, a natural amphitheater surrounded by wooded hills. It was a strong defensive position that would allow his army to rest while maintaining good visibility of the surrounding terrain. His commanders deployed the various contingents with practiced efficiency, creating overlapping fields of fire and establishing clear lines of communication. The Imagawa war machine settled into position like a great beast preparing to spring. The heat of the day was becoming oppressive, and many soldiers gratefully accepted the chance to rest in whatever shade they could find. Armor was loosened, weapons set aside, and the first sake began to flow as the men celebrated their recent victories at the border fortresses. The mood was festive rather than martial, more reminiscent of a victory celebration than an army preparing for battle. After all, what threat could the pitiful Oda forces possibly pose to such a magnificent host? Yet even as his enemies relaxed, Nobunaga was putting the final touches on a plan that would astonish the world. His intimate knowledge of the local terrain had revealed to him possibilities that no outsider could perceive. The very geography that made Yoshimoto's position defensively strong also made it vulnerable to certain forms of attack. The wooded hills that provided such excellent observation posts could also conceal an approaching enemy until the final moments. The narrow valley that concentrated Imagawa strength also limited their ability to maneuver when threatened. Most crucially, Nobunaga had recognized something that Yoshimoto's more conventional military thinking had missed. Large armies were powerful, but they were also unwieldy. They required time to react to changing circumstances, time to relay orders through chains of command, time to redeploy forces from one position to another. A smaller, more agile force that could strike with perfect timing and absolute surprise might achieve what seemed impossible through conventional means. As the sun climbed toward its zenith on what would become one of the most famous days in Japanese military history, both commanders made their final preparations. Yoshimoto, secure in his overwhelming advantage, planned to rest his forces through the heat of the day before resuming the advance toward Kiyosu Castle. Nobunaga, knowing that every passing moment brought him closer to discovery and defeat, prepared to gamble everything on a single desperate throw of the dice. The stage was set, the players were in position, and destiny waited in the wings. In the hills of Okehazama, the impossible was about to become reality. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the hills of Okehazama as both armies settled into their positions. In the Imagawa camp, the atmosphere had shifted from military precision to casual celebration. Soldiers lounged in whatever shade they could find, their armor unbuckled and weapons carelessly stacked nearby. Rice wine flowed freely as veterans regaled younger warriors with tales of past conquests. The recent victories at Washizu and Maroon had filled the ranks with confidence, and many believed the hardest fighting was already behind them. Yoshimoto himself had established his command post in an elaborate pavilion at the heart of the camp. Silk banners displaying his family crest fluttered in the humid air while servants attended to his every need. Maps were spread across low tables, but they showed routes to Kyoto rather than tactical dispositions around Okehazama. In his mind, this was merely a rest stop on the road to greater glory. The real campaign would begin once they reached the capital and began dismantling what remained of the Ashikaga shogunate. The great warlord had every reason for confidence. His intelligence network had confirmed that Nobunaga's force numbered no more than 3,000 men. Even accounting for possible reinforcements, the mathematical reality was inescapable. The Imagawa enjoyed at least an 8-to-1 advantage in numbers, supplemented by superior equipment, more experienced commanders, and a proven track record of victory. By every conventional measure of military strength, the outcome was predetermined. Yet high in the wooded hills surrounding the valley, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Nobunaga had divided his small force into even smaller units, each moving independently through terrain they knew as intimately as their own homes. These were not the grand formations beloved by traditional warfare, but something entirely new, compact groups of professional soldiers moving with the stealth and purpose of assassins. Every man knew his role in the coming assault. The Ashigaru spearmen would form the striking edge, their long weapons perfect for the close quarters fighting that Nobunaga envisioned. Behind them came the samurai, ready to exploit whatever breakthrough the initial assault achieved. Archers were positioned to provide covering fire from concealed positions among the trees. Most importantly, every soldier understood that surprise was their only advantage, and once lost, it could never be regained. As the day wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. In the Imagawa camp below, more and more soldiers had shed their armor entirely, seeking relief from the oppressive temperature. What had begun as a tactical rest had evolved into something approaching a festival. Cooking fires sent columns of smoke into the still air while the sound of laughter and conversation echoed off the surrounding hills. It was the sound of an army that believed itself invincible. Nobunaga observed this scene from his concealed position with the cold calculation of a predator studying its prey. Every detail was noted and analyzed. The disposition of guards, the location of command posts, the routes between different sections of the camp. His scouts had spent hours mapping the enemy positions, identifying weak points and escape routes. This was intelligence warfare at its finest, the systematic gathering of information that would be transformed into tactical advantage. The afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen when nature herself seemed to conspire in Nobunaga's favor. Dark clouds had been building on the western horizon throughout the day, and now they began to advance across the sky with ominous purpose. The air grew heavy and still, charged with the electric tension that precedes a thunderstorm. Veterans in both armies recognized the signs and began preparing for the deluge that was surely coming. In the Imagawa camp, this development was viewed as a minor inconvenience. Servants rushed to secure pavilions and equipment, while soldiers sought whatever shelter they could find. The coming storm would delay their advance by a few hours, but nothing more. Some commanders even welcomed the prospect of cooler temperatures and relief from the oppressive heat that had dominated the day. Nobunaga saw something entirely different in those gathering clouds. Here was the perfect cover for his assault, a gift from the gods that would mask his approach until the final moments. He had always believed that victory belonged to those bold enough to seize unexpected opportunities, and this was exactly such a moment. His men received their final orders with grim determination. They would attack during the height of the storm, using the chaos and confusion to multiply the effect of their surprise. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the Oda forces moved into their final positions. Thunder rumbled across the hills, drowning out the sound of footsteps and the whispered commands that coordinated their advance. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the valley below in brief, stark flashes that revealed an enemy caught completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. In those final moments before the storm reached its full fury, both armies waited in very different states of readiness. The Imagawa huddled under whatever shelter they could improvise, their weapons set aside, their armor removed, their attention focused entirely on staying dry. They were a mighty host, reduced to the level of common travelers caught in a sudden downpour. High above them in the wooded hills, 3,000 Oda warriors crouched in the rain with weapons ready and hearts steeled for the fight of their lives. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing almost certain death. Yet they possessed something their enemies lacked in that crucial moment: absolute unity of purpose and the unshakable belief that their leader could achieve the impossible. The storm struck with sudden violence, transforming the peaceful valley into a cauldron of wind and rain. Visibility dropped to mere yards as sheets of water swept across the landscape. Thunder crashed overhead with deafening force, while lightning turned the world into a series of frozen tableaux. It was as if the very heavens had opened to witness what was about to unfold. Through this tempest came death itself, moving with silent purpose down the wooded slopes. Nobunaga led from the front, his figure barely visible through the driving rain as he guided his men toward their destiny. Behind him stretched a line of warriors who had chosen to follow their lord into what every rational calculation said was certain doom. They moved like ghosts through the storm, their footsteps masked by thunder, their approach hidden by the very fury of nature itself. The Imagawa sentries, such as they were, had long since abandoned their posts for whatever dry ground they could find. Those few who remained at their positions were focused entirely on the discomfort of the moment, rather than watching for enemies that no sane commander would deploy in such conditions. The very impossibility of an attack during the height of the storm had become the perfect guarantee that such an attack would go undetected. The Battle of Okehazama shattered every assumption about warfare in 16th century Japan. In a single afternoon of thunder and steel, Nobunaga transformed himself from the fool of a wari into the architect of a unified nation. Yoshimoto's dream of empire died with him in that rain-soaked valley, while the young upstart who dared challenge the impossible would go on to reshape Japanese history. Sometimes the greatest victories belong not to the mightiest army, but to those bold enough to strike when others believe victory is impossible. In the summer of 1575, beneath the scorching sun of Mikawa province, a fortress stood on the edge of annihilation. Nagashino Castle, perched like a stone sentinel above the rushing waters where two rivers converged, housed just 500 desperate souls. Outside its wooden walls, a sea of red-armored warriors stretched beyond counting. 15,000 of Japan's most feared cavalry had come to crush this tiny stronghold, and with it, the dreams of those who dared stand against the legendary Takeda clan. But this was no ordinary siege. Hidden within those castle walls was a weapon that would shatter centuries of samurai tradition, a technology so revolutionary that it would rewrite the very nature of warfare itself. What unfolded in those fateful days would become the most decisive battle of Japan's chaotic Sengoku period, where honor met innovation, where the old ways collided with the unstoppable march of progress. This is the story of courage beyond measure, of sacrifice that echoes through the ages, and of the moment when 600 defenders changed the course of Japanese history forever. The clash at Nagashino would prove that sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior numbers or legendary skill, but from the unbreakable will to stand firm when all hope seems lost. To understand the magnitude of what transpired at Nagashino, we must first journey back to an era when Japan bled from countless wounds. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, had torn the island nation into a patchwork of competing domains. For over a century, feudal lords had battled relentlessly for supremacy, their ambitions leaving villages in ash and fields soaked with blood. It was a time when survival depended not on mercy or diplomacy, but on the strength of one's sword and the loyalty of one's warriors. Among the most formidable of these warlords stood the Takeda clan of Kai province. Their very name struck terror into the hearts of enemies across Japan. Under the brilliant leadership of Takeda Shingen, known as the Tiger of Kai, they had forged an army unlike any the world had seen. These were not mere mounted warriors, but a disciplined cavalry force that moved with the precision of a deadly machine. Shingen had revolutionized warfare itself. While other armies still relied heavily on foot soldiers and archers, he transformed his samurai from bow-wielding horsemen into lance-bearing cavalry. The sight of his red-armored riders thundering across the battlefield, their long spears leveled like the quills of some monstrous beast, had broken the will of countless foes before contact was even made. They called his force the Kiba Gundan, the mounted army, and for good reason. The Battle of Mikitagahara had cemented their legend. There, Shingen's cavalry had crushed a force led by none other than Tokugawa Ieyasu, the future shogun himself. The young Ieyasu had barely escaped with his life, his army scattered like leaves before the Takeda storm. That victory had sent shockwaves through Japan, establishing the Takeda as the supreme military power of their age. But legends, like men, are mortal. In 1573, Takeda Shingen fell ill and died, leaving behind an empire built on conquest and a son burning with ambition. Takeda Katsuyori was no mere shadow of his father. He possessed the same fierce determination, the same hunger for glory that had driven the Takeda to greatness. Yet where Shingen had been patient and calculating, Katsuyori was impetuous, eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. The opportunity came in the form of Mikawa province, the domain of Tokugawa Ieyasu. This region, with its strategic mountain passes and fertile valleys, represented the key to expanding Takeda power eastward. If Katsuyori could crush the Tokugawa forces and claim Mikawa, he would not only avenge his father's unfinished business but also position himself for an assault on the capital itself. Standing in his way was an unlikely alliance. Tokugawa Ieyasu, still smarting from his humiliation at Sekigahara, had forged a pact with one of Japan's most ambitious and ruthless leaders, Oda Nobunaga. Known as the Demon King for his willingness to employ any means necessary to achieve victory, Nobunaga was already well on his way to unifying Japan under his iron fist. The alliance between these two formidable warlords represented a threat that even the mighty Takeda could not ignore. In June of 1575, as the summer heat shimmered across the mountain valleys of Mikawa, Katsuyori made his move. Leading 15,000 of his finest warriors, including the elite cavalry that had made his father's name legendary, he struck deep into Tokugawa territory. His target was not some distant stronghold or wealthy town, but a modest fortress that controlled the vital transportation routes through the region. Nagashino Castle sat like a chess piece, positioned to command the entire board. Built on a natural promontory where the Onagawa and Takigawa rivers merged to form the mighty Toyokawa, it commanded the only practical routes through the mountainous terrain. The fortress itself was not imposing by the standards of the great castles of Japan. Its wooden structures and stone walls enclosed an area roughly the size of a few city blocks, but its position made it worth more than its weight in gold. The castle's garrison numbered just 500 souls, a mix of samurai, ashigaru foot soldiers, and support personnel under the command of Okudaira Sadamasa, a loyal retainer of the Tokugawa clan. These men knew full well what they faced. The red tide of Takeda cavalry that appeared on the horizon was 30 times their number, led by commanders whose names were whispered with fear across Japan. Yet the defenders possessed advantages that numbers alone could not overcome. Within the castle's armory lay 200 of the most revolutionary weapons ever to reach Japanese shores, Portuguese matchlock firearms that had arrived with European traders just decades earlier. These were not the crude early versions that had first appeared, but refined weapons crafted by Japanese smiths who had perfected the foreign technology. Alongside them sat a single cannon, a bronze beast capable of hurling iron death across impossible distances. The siege began with the methodical efficiency that marked all Takeda operations. Katsuyori positioned his forces to command the western and northern approaches, the only directions from which the castle could be effectively attacked. The eastern and southern faces were protected by steep cliffs that dropped away to the rushing rivers below, natural barriers that made assault impossible. But the Takeda were not content to simply starve out the defenders. Wave after wave of red-armored warriors hurled themselves against the castle's defenses, their war cries echoing off the valley walls. They attempted river crossings under cover of darkness, tried to undermine the walls with siege tunnels, and launched frontal assaults that turned the ground before the gates into a charnel house. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew their cause was righteous and their position desperate. The matchlock guns spoke with voices of thunder, each shot capable of punching through the finest armor at close range. The cannon bellowed its defiance across the valley, sending iron balls crashing through the ranks of attackers. Yet for every Takeda warrior who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. Days stretched into a week as the siege intensified. The castle's food supplies dwindled, and the constant attacks left the garrison exhausted and bloodied. It became clear that without relief, Nagashino would fall, and with it, the strategic balance of the entire region. The fate of the Tokugawa alliance, perhaps of Japan itself, hung in the balance as the red banners of the Takeda closed ever tighter around the beleaguered fortress. In this moment of ultimate crisis, when hope seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon, a single man would step forward to change the course of history. His name was Tori Tsunemon, and his rank was so lowly that many samurai would not have acknowledged his existence. Yet this humble Ashigaru foot soldier was about to undertake a mission that would inspire generations and light the fuse for one of the most revolutionary battles ever fought on Japanese soil. As darkness fell over the besieged fortress on the seventh night, the sound of battle gave way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant murmur of enemy campfires. Within Nagashino's battered walls, the defenders huddled in exhausted silence, their weapons cleaned and ready, their eyes hollow with the weight of impending doom. The Takeda noose had tightened with each passing hour, and every man knew that dawn might bring their final stand. It was then that Tori Tsunemon approached his commander with a proposal so audacious, so fraught with peril, that it bordered on madness. The young Ashigaru, barely 20 years old and possessing neither noble blood nor distinguished lineage, volunteered for a mission that seasoned samurai would have considered suicide. He would slip through the Takeda lines, cross 35 kilometers of enemy-controlled territory, and reach Tokugawa Ieyasu's stronghold at Okazaki Castle to plead for immediate relief. The plan was desperate in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Tsunemon would have to swim the frigid river that formed the castle's natural moat, evade thousands of enemy sentries, and navigate treacherous mountain paths in complete darkness. Even if he succeeded in reaching Okazaki, there was no guarantee that help would arrive in time. Yet as the young soldier knelt before his lord, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his undertaking, every man present understood that this might be their only hope. Under the cover of a moonless night, Tsunemon shed his armor and weapons, keeping only a small tanto dagger and a scroll bearing the castle's desperate plea for aid. He slipped into the icy waters of the moat, the current threatening to sweep him away as he fought to reach the opposite bank. Behind him, the castle's walls rose like shadows against the star-filled sky, while ahead lay a gauntlet of enemy patrols and certain death if discovered. The Takeda had positioned their forces with the precision of master strategists. Campfires dotted the landscape like fallen stars, each one representing a cluster of warriors ready to raise the alarm at the first sign of movement. Tsunemon moved like a ghost through this deadly maze, his bare feet finding purchase on rocky slopes, his breathing controlled to silence despite the hammering of his heart. Every shadow might conceal an enemy spear. Every sound could herald his discovery and execution. Hours passed like days as he climbed through the mountain passes, following paths known only to local hunters and smugglers. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rocks that could send a man tumbling into the void and narrow ledges that required the balance of a mountain cat. Yet Tsunemon pressed on, driven by the knowledge that 500 lives hung in the balance with every step he took. As dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the exhausted messenger finally glimpsed the familiar banners of Tokugawa forces in the distance. Okazaki Castle stood proud and strong, its towers reaching toward the heavens like prayers made manifest, but Tsunemon's ordeal was far from over. He still had to convince the guards of his identity and purpose, then gain an audience with lords who might dismiss his plea as the ravings of a desperate fool. Fortune smiled upon the brave messenger, as he was quickly brought before Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. The future shogun, still bearing the psychological scars of his defeat at Sekigahara, listened intently as Tsunemon delivered his desperate message. The young soldier spoke with the eloquence of desperation, painting a vivid picture of Nagashino's plight and the strategic importance of its preservation. What happened next would alter the course of Japanese history. Ieyasu, recognizing both the opportunity and the necessity, immediately dispatched messengers to his powerful ally, Oda Nobunaga. The Demon King's response was swift and decisive. Within hours, orders went out across his domain, calling his massive army to prepare for an unprecedented campaign. This would not be a mere relief expedition, but a full-scale confrontation with the legendary Takeda cavalry. Meanwhile, Suneman faced a choice that would define his legacy forever. Having delivered his message and secured the promise of aid, the logical course would have been to remain safely at Okazaki until the relief force departed. Instead, the young warrior chose to return to Nagashino, determined to bring word of the approaching salvation to his comrades, still trapped within the castle walls. The return journey proved even more perilous than his initial escape. The Takeda forces, now aware that someone had slipped through their lines, had doubled their patrols and increased their vigilance. Every approach to the castle was watched, every possible route of entry guarded by alert sentries. Yet Suneman pressed forward, driven by a loyalty that transcended personal survival. His capture was inevitable. On the morning of his attempted return, Takeda scouts spotted the lone figure attempting to reach the castle gates. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Suneman found himself dragged before Katsuyori himself, the young Takeda lord, whose ambitions had brought this conflict to its climax. Katsuyori was no fool. He recognized immediately the significance of this humble soldier's presence and the implications of his desperate mission. If word had indeed reached the Tokugawa forces, if relief was truly coming, then the entire strategic situation would shift dramatically. The Takeda commander saw an opportunity to turn this setback to his advantage, to break the defenders' morale with a single, devastating blow. The proposal was as cruel as it was clever. Suneman would be spared, even rewarded, if he would approach the castle walls and shout to the defenders that no help was coming, that they had been abandoned to their fate. The psychological impact would be devastating, potentially causing the garrison to surrender without further bloodshed. All the young soldier had to do was lie to his comrades, betray their trust, and save his own life in the process. What followed became one of the most celebrated acts of loyalty in Japanese history. As Takeda warriors positioned Suneman within shouting distance of the castle walls, hundreds of defenders gathered along the battlements to hear his words. The silence was absolute, as the young messenger took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would be his last. Instead of the lie his captors expected, Suneman's voice rang out clear and strong across the valley. He told his comrades that help was indeed coming, that Ieyasu and Nobunaga were marching to their aid, that they must hold fast just a little longer. The words had barely left his lips when Takeda's spears found their mark, but the message had been delivered. The defenders erupted in cheers, their spirits soaring with renewed hope, while their enemies looked on in stunned admiration for such unwavering loyalty. The young Ashigaru's sacrifice had accomplished far more than merely maintaining morale. His heroic death had become a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance that would inspire the defenders through the desperate hours to come. Even among the Takeda ranks, warriors spoke in hushed tones of the foot soldier who had chosen honor over life, loyalty over survival. As news of the incident spread through both armies, the psychological landscape of the siege began to shift. The Takeda forces, for all their martial prowess and legendary discipline, found themselves facing an enemy whose resolve had been hardened to diamond by witnessing such extraordinary courage. The defenders of Nagashino, inspired by Suneman's example, prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible, but the true test was yet to come. Even as the castle's garrison steeled themselves for the final assault, a massive army was already on the march. Oda Nobunaga had mobilized 30,000 of his finest troops, while Tokugawa Ieyasu gathered 8,000 more. This combined force represented one of the largest armies ever assembled in Japan, a host capable of challenging even the legendary Takeda cavalry on equal terms. Yet numbers alone would not determine the outcome of the coming battle. Hidden within the ranks of Nobunaga's army was a weapon that would revolutionize warfare not just in Japan but across the world. 3,000 matchlock firearms, crafted by master smiths who had perfected the Portuguese technology, waited to speak with voices of thunder and flame. The morning of June 28, 1575, dawned with a tension that seemed to electrify the very air above Shitaragahara Plain. Across the rolling hills and verdant rice paddies, two of the most formidable armies Japan had ever assembled faced each other in a confrontation that would echo through the centuries. The allied banner of Oda and Tokugawa flew proudly above 38,000 warriors, while the crimson standards of the Takeda marked the positions of 15,000 of the most feared cavalry in the world. Oda Nobunaga had not come to fight a conventional battle. The Demon King understood that facing the legendary Takeda cavalry in open combat would be suicide, no matter how many men he commanded. Instead, he had chosen his ground with the calculating precision of a master strategist, positioning his forces in a natural depression that concealed their true numbers, while maximizing the advantages of his revolutionary weapons. The sight that greeted the Allied army as they took their positions was both magnificent and terrifying. Stretching across the western approaches to Nagashino, Katsuyori's forces presented a tapestry of martial splendor that spoke of centuries of military tradition. The famous red armor of the Takeda cavalry gleamed like fresh blood in the morning sun, while their long lances formed a forest of steel points that seemed to pierce the sky itself. At the heart of this fearsome host rode the 24 generals of Takeda Shingen, legendary commanders whose names were whispered with awe throughout Japan. Yamagata Masakage, master of the cavalry charge and hero of a dozen campaigns. Baba Nobuharu, the old fox whose tactical brilliance had won victories against impossible odds. Naito Masatoyo, whose loyalty to the Takeda cause was matched only by his skill with the spear. These were men who had ridden with Shingen himself, veterans of countless battles who had never known defeat. Yet as imposing as this array of martial power appeared, Nobunaga's forces were preparing something unprecedented in Japanese warfare. Hidden behind hastily constructed wooden palisades, 3,000 Ashigaru foot soldiers knelt with matchlock firearms in their hands. These were not the crude weapons that had first arrived with Portuguese traders, but refined instruments of death crafted by Japanese smiths who had surpassed their European teachers in both quality and quantity of production. The defensive line stretched for nearly 2 kilometers along the western edge of the valley, a barrier of sharpened stakes and earthworks that transformed the natural terrain into a killing ground. The small Rengo River wound through the middle of the battlefield, its banks lined with flooded rice paddies that would turn the ground into a treacherous quagmire for charging cavalry. Each Oda soldier had carried with him a long wooden stake during the march to Nagashino, and these simple implements had been transformed into a formidable obstacle. The palisade they created was not merely a physical barrier, but a psychological one as well. Behind its protection, common foot soldiers could stand against the flower of samurai nobility, matchlock guns making peasants the equal of princes in the democracy of death. Katsuyori surveyed the Allied position from his command post on the heights above the plain. The young Takeda lord was no fool, despite his reputation for impetuosity. He could see the defensive preparations, recognize the threat posed by the firearms, understand that this would not be the swift cavalry charge that had brought his father so much glory. Yet he also knew that retreat was impossible. His forces were committed, his reputation at stake, his father's legacy hanging in the balance. The pressure to attack came not just from strategic necessity, but from the very nature of the Takeda military system. These were warriors bred for aggression, cavalry trained to charge at the first opportunity, generals whose entire tactical doctrine revolved around the devastating impact of mounted assault. To withdraw without battle would be to admit that the age of the Takeda was ending, that new technologies and tactics had rendered their way of war obsolete. As the morning mist began to burn away under the climbing sun, the first probing attacks commenced. Small groups of Takeda cavalry tested the Allied defenses, seeking weak points in the palisade, attempting to draw the Ashigaru into premature volleys that would leave them vulnerable during the long reload time. The sound of sporadic gunfire echoed across the valley as defenders replied to these feints with disciplined restraint. Nobunaga had drilled his musketeers relentlessly in the art of volley fire, a technique that transformed individual weapons into instruments of mass destruction. Rather than allowing each soldier to fire at will, the 3,000 firearms were organized into rotating groups of 1,000 each. As the first rank discharged their weapons, the second rank would step forward, while the third prepared to reload. This continuous cycle of fire would theoretically provide unbroken volleys against any assault. The reality of battle, however, proved more complex than theory suggested. The matchlock firearms of the era were temperamental weapons, prone to misfires in damp conditions and requiring careful maintenance of their firing mechanisms. Each gun took at least 45 seconds to reload under ideal circumstances, and battlefield conditions were far from ideal. Smoke from the black powder charges obscured vision, while the stress of combat made hands shake and fingers fumble with the delicate process of priming and loading. Yet as the morning wore on and the Takeda probes intensified, it became clear that something revolutionary was taking place on the field of Nagashino. The traditional advantage of mounted warriors over infantry was being systematically negated by the combination of defensive terrain and coordinated firepower. Horses that had charged fearlessly into sword-wielding formations balked at the thunder and lightning of massed gunfire, while riders found their armor inadequate protection against the penetrating power of lead bullets at close range. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. The Takeda cavalry had built their reputation on the terror they inspired. The sight of their crimson ranks thundering across the battlefield, with lances leveled and war cries echoing. Now they faced an enemy that did not break and run at their approach, defenders who remained hidden behind their barriers until the last possible moment before unleashing devastating volleys at point-blank range. Katsuyori realized that half measures would not suffice against such tactics. If the defensive line was to be broken, it would require a full-scale assault by his finest troops, a charge that would either shatter the Allied army or destroy his own forces in the attempt. The moment had come to commit everything to a single, decisive throw of the dice. The order rippled through the Takeda ranks like wildfire. Horns sounded across the valley as 15,000 warriors began to form their battle lines. The famous Red Cavalry took position in the center, their lances gleaming like a forest of deadly thorns. On the flanks, Ashigaru foot soldiers and mounted arquebusiers prepared to support the main assault. Behind them all, Katsuyori himself took his place, ready to lead from the front in the tradition of his legendary father. The defenders watched this martial pageantry with a mixture of awe and terror. Even veteran warriors could not help but be impressed by the sight of so many mounted samurai arrayed for battle, their colorful banners snapping in the wind, their armor catching the sun like scattered jewels. This was the flower of Japanese military tradition, the culmination of centuries of warrior culture, preparing to crash against the future in a collision that would determine the fate of a nation. The thunder of matchlocks at Nagashino marked more than the end of a siege or the defeat of a legendary army. It signaled the death of an era and the birth of a new Japan where technology would triumph over tradition, where common soldiers could humble the mightiest samurai. The brave defenders who held those walls, inspired by Tori Sunemon's ultimate sacrifice, had witnessed the future of warfare itself. In choosing courage over surrender, innovation over convention, they forever changed the course of a nation's destiny. In the mist-shrouded valleys of central Japan, on a rain-soaked morning in October 1600, two massive armies faced each other across a narrow plain that would determine the fate of an entire nation. This was no ordinary battle between rival wation of decades of civil war, political warlords. This was the culmination scheming and ruthless ambition. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, a master strategist who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. On the other, Ishida Mitsunari led a coalition of lords determined to preserve the legacy of Japan's greatest unifier. What happened next would end the age of endless warfare and forge a dynasty that would rule Japan for over 2.5 centuries. This is the story of Sekigahara, the gamble that united all of Japan. The year 1598 marked the end of an era. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who had risen to become Japan's supreme ruler, lay dying in his magnificent castle at Osaka. For the first time in decades, the archipelago faced the prospect of unified leadership slipping away. Hideyoshi had achieved what seemed impossible, bringing the warring provinces under his banner through a combination of military genius and political cunning. Yet as his strength faded, the great unifier confronted a problem that had plagued rulers throughout history. His heir, Hideyori, was only 6 years old, far too young to command the loyalty of battle-hardened generals who had carved their domains from blood and steel. Recognizing the precarious nature of his legacy, Hideyoshi established a council of 5 regents to govern in his young son's name. These 5 men, known as the Teiro, were among the most powerful daimyo in Japan: Maeda Toshie, Mori Teramoto, Ukita Hidei, Uesugi Kagekatsu, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each commanded vast armies and controlled territories that could sustain years of warfare. The system was designed to prevent any single lord from seizing power, but it was built on a foundation of mutual distrust and barely contained ambition. Among these 5 regions, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood apart. While his colleagues had grown comfortable in their wealth and status, Ieyasu possessed something far more dangerous: patience honed by a lifetime of strategic thinking. His childhood had been marked by hardship and uncertainty. As a young boy, he had been held hostage by rival clans, learning valuable lessons about survival, negotiation, and the art of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. These early experiences had forged him into a different kind of leader, one who understood that true power came not from immediate gratification, but from careful preparation and timing. The death of Hideyoshi in September 1598 shattered the delicate balance of the regency almost immediately. Within months, the careful structure began to crumble as old rivalries resurfaced and new ambitions emerged. Ieyasu moved quickly to consolidate his position, relocating to Fushimi Castle in Kyoto and approving strategic marriages between his clan and neighboring domains. To his fellow regents and many other daimyo, these actions appeared to be the opening moves in a bid for supreme power. The situation deteriorated further in 1599 with the death of Maeda Toshie, who had served as a moderating influence among the regents. With Toshie gone, there was no one left who could effectively mediate between the competing factions. The regency system, already strained by personal animosities and conflicting interests, began to split into 2 hostile camps. On one side gathered those who remained loyal to the Toyotomi legacy and viewed Ieyasu's growing influence with alarm. Leading this faction was Ishida Mitsunari, a man whose background could not have been more different from Ieyasu's. Where Ieyasu was a seasoned warrior who had spent decades on battlefields, Mitsunari was primarily an administrator, a master of logistics and financial management who had won Hideyoshi's favor through his exceptional organizational skills and devotion to the tea ceremony. His loyalty to the Toyotomi cause was absolute, but his lack of military experience would prove to be a critical weakness in the trials ahead. Mitsunari's supporters included 3 of the remaining regents. Mori Terumoto controlled vast territories in western Japan and commanded the nominal leadership of what would become known as the Western Army. Ukita Hidae brought his own forces and the legitimacy of his position as one of Hideyoshi's chosen regents. Uesugi Kajikatsu controlled domains in northern Japan, adding geographic diversity to the anti-Tokugawa coalition. Together they represented a formidable alliance, but one that was held together more by shared opposition to Ieyasu than by genuine unity of purpose. The geographic divisions of these alliances were not accidental. Ieyasu's power base lay primarily in eastern Japan, where his domains provided him with vast resources and a network of loyal vassals who had served the Tokugawa clan for generations. His supporters, who would form the Eastern Army, included many daimyo who had grown wealthy and powerful under his patronage. They understood that their continued prosperity depended on Ieyasu's success, creating bonds of mutual interest that went far deeper than mere feudal obligation. The Western Army, by contrast, drew its strength from the established lords of western and southern Japan, many of whom had been prominent under Hideyoshi's rule. Their motivations were more complex and sometimes contradictory. Some genuinely believed in preserving the Toyotomi legacy for young Hideyori. Others saw an opportunity to prevent Ieyasu from becoming too powerful. Still, others harbored personal grudges or sought to protect their own domains from Tokugawa expansion. This diversity of motivations would prove to be both a strength and a fatal weakness when the moment of truth arrived. As tensions escalated throughout 1599 and early 1600, both sides engaged in an elaborate dance of political maneuvering. Secret negotiations were conducted, alliances were forged and broken, and spies moved freely between the opposing camps. Ieyasu demonstrated his mastery of this shadow war, using his vast intelligence network to stay informed of his enemies' plans while spreading disinformation to sow confusion among their ranks. His agents worked tirelessly to identify potential defectors within the Western Army, offering rewards for loyalty and exploiting existing grievances against Mitsunari's leadership. The breaking point came in the summer of 1600. Ieyasu had been drawn away from the capital to deal with a potential threat from the Uesugi clan in the north, providing Mitsunari with what appeared to be a perfect opportunity to strike. The Western army leaders called their allies to arms, planning a coordinated attack that would catch Ieyasu's forces divided and vulnerable. It was a sound strategy in theory, but it failed to account for Ieyasu's superior intelligence network and his ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Rather than being caught off guard, Ieyasu had anticipated this move. His network of spies had kept him informed of the Western Army's preparations, allowing him to prepare countermeasures well in advance. When Mitsunari's forces began to move, Ieyasu was ready with a response that would demonstrate his tactical brilliance and strategic vision. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would determine not just the immediate question of political control, but the entire future direction of Japanese civilization. Two armies, representing different visions of Japan's destiny, began their march toward a small village called Sekigahara, where the narrow mountain passes would force them into a battle that neither could avoid. The greatest gamble in Japanese history was about to begin. The campaign that followed would showcase Ieyasu's mastery of deception and rapid movement. While Mitsunari believed he had cornered his rival in the distant northern provinces, Ieyasu executed a brilliant feint that left his enemies scrambling to respond. Instead of becoming bogged down in a prolonged campaign against the Uesugi clan, he quickly resolved the northern threat through negotiation and intimidation, then pivoted his entire army westward with stunning speed. The key to Ieyasu's strategy lay in controlling the vital highways that connected eastern and western Japan. The Tokaido and Nakasendo roads were the arteries through which armies, supplies, and information flowed across the archipelago. By seizing strategic castles along these routes, Ieyasu could effectively cut off his enemy's lines of communication while securing his own supply lines for the decisive confrontation ahead. His first major success came with the capture of Gifu Castle, a fortress that commanded a crucial position along the Nakasendo Road. The castle's fall sent shockwaves through the Western Army, demonstrating that Ieyasu's forces were not trapped in the north as they had believed, but were instead advancing rapidly toward the heartland of Japan. The psychological impact was as important as the strategic advantage, as wavering daimyo began to question whether they had chosen the winning side. Meanwhile, Mitsunari found himself caught between competing pressures and conflicting information. His spies reported that Ieyasu's next target might be Sawayama Castle, Mitsunari's own stronghold, which would leave the path open for a Tokugawa march on Kyoto and Osaka. The prospect of losing the capital and failing to protect young Hideyori filled Mitsunari with dread. Every hour of delay increased the risk that Ieyasu would outmaneuver him completely, yet rushing into battle without proper coordination could prove equally disastrous. The rain that began falling on the evening of October 20th added another layer of uncertainty to an already volatile situation. Both armies were forced to march through the darkness, their movements hampered by mud and limited visibility. Soldiers struggled to keep their equipment dry while maintaining formation in the treacherous conditions. The weather seemed to mirror the murky political situation, where loyalties shifted like shadows and the outcome remained impossible to predict. As dawn approached on October 21st, the two armies converged on the small village of Sekigahara. The location was not chosen by chance or accident. This narrow valley, surrounded by hills and bisected by the Nakasendo Road, represented a natural bottleneck where Japan's destiny would be decided. The Western Army, despite arriving first, found themselves in the tactically inferior position. Their forces were spread across multiple hills, making coordination difficult and leaving them vulnerable to the kind of concentrated assault that Ieyasu excelled at delivering. The fog that shrouded the battlefield at first light seemed to hold the breath of history itself. Through the mist, over 160,000 samurai prepared for what they knew would be the defining battle of their age. The Eastern Army, numbering approximately 80,000 men, took up positions in the valley floor, their formations tight and disciplined. Facing them across the narrow plain, the Western Army's 80,000 warriors occupied the surrounding heights, their banners barely visible through the swirling vapor. Among the Western Army's commanders, doubts had been growing for weeks. Many had agreed to support Mitsunari reluctantly, motivated more by fear of Tokugawa dominance than by genuine enthusiasm for the cause. Some harbored deep personal resentments against Mitsunari himself, viewing him as an upstart administrator who lacked the military credentials to lead seasoned warriors into battle. These underlying tensions would prove crucial as the morning progressed. Ieyasu, positioned with his reserves behind the main battle line, surveyed the scene with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment. His intelligence network had provided him with detailed information about the Western Army's positions and, more importantly, about the secret negotiations that had been conducted with several key commanders. The seeds of betrayal had already been planted, requiring only the right moment to bloom into decisive action. The thick fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full scope of the forces arrayed across the battlefield. Banners fluttered in the morning breeze, displaying the mon of dozens of great clans whose ancestors had fought each other for centuries. Today, old alliances would be tested, and new ones forged in blood and steel. The age of the warring states was about to reach its final devastating climax. When the first war cries echoed across the valley, they carried with them the weight of Japan's entire future. This was more than a battle between rival armies. It was a collision between two fundamentally different visions of what the nation could become. On one side stood those who sought to preserve the complex web of competing loyalties that had defined the Sengoku period. On the other, marched those who believed that only unified command under a single, unchallenged authority could bring lasting peace to the blood-soaked islands. The opening moves of the battle would reveal just how carefully Ieyasu had prepared for this moment, and how thoroughly he understood not just the art of war, but the deeper currents of human nature that would ultimately determine victory or defeat. As the morning mist began to dissipate, revealing the full magnitude of the forces gathered at Sekigahara, the first shots of the battle rang out across the valley. It was Naomasa, one of Ieyasu's most trusted retainers, who fired the opening volley. His red-armored cavalry, known throughout Japan for their fierce reputation, charged forward without waiting for orders, striking directly at the heart of Yukita Hide's formation on the Western Army's front line. The breach of protocol was deliberate. Naomasa understood that in a battle of this magnitude, seizing the initiative could prove decisive. His unauthorized attack sent ripples of confusion through both armies as commanders struggled to adapt their carefully laid plans to the sudden eruption of violence. The thunder of hooves mixed with the crash of steel as his cavalry smashed into the western lines, their crimson banners cutting through the grey morning like streaks of blood. Across the battlefield, the sound of arquebus fire began to crackle like breaking wood. The Portuguese weapons, introduced to Japan decades earlier, had revolutionized warfare on the islands. Volleys of lead balls tore through the ranks of advancing samurai, their armor offering little protection against the devastating power of gunpowder. The acrid smoke of burning powder mixed with the fog, creating an eerie twilight that obscured friend from foe. From his command position, Ieyasu watched the opening exchanges with the practiced eye of a veteran who had witnessed dozens of battles. He could see immediately that his gamble was paying off. The Western Army's response to Naomasa's assault was disjointed and hesitant, revealing the underlying tensions within Mitsunari's coalition. Units that should have moved in coordinated support instead hesitated, waiting for orders that came too slowly or not at all. The center of the battlefield erupted into a maelstrom of violence as more Eastern Army units joined the assault. Fukushima Masanori, despite his initial anger at being upstaged by Naomasa, threw his forces forward with typical ferocity. His men, veterans of Hideyoshi's Korean campaigns, fought with the disciplined fury of professional soldiers who understood that their lord's fortunes depended on victory here. Their battle cries echoed off the surrounding hills as they carved deep into the western formations. Yet for all the sound and fury of the initial assault, the battle remained far from decided. The Western Army's numerical strength and superior positioning allowed them to absorb the Eastern attack without breaking. Yukita Hide's forces, though pressed hard, maintained their cohesion and fought back with desperate courage. These men knew that defeat would mean not just death, but the complete destruction of everything they had fought to preserve. As the morning wore on, the battle settled into a grinding contest of attrition. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage through force of arms alone. The narrow confines of the valley prevented either army from bringing its full strength to bear, while the complex terrain made coordinated movements nearly impossible. Individual units fought isolated battles within the larger conflict, their struggles often invisible to the commanders who sought to direct the overall flow of combat. It was during this period of apparent stalemate that the true nature of Ieyasu's strategy began to reveal itself. The secret negotiations that had occupied months of preparation were about to bear fruit in the most spectacular fashion. High on Mount Matsuo, overlooking the main battlefield, Kobayakawa Hideaki sat motionless with his 15,000 warriors. The young lord had been positioned to deliver a crushing blow against the Eastern Army's flank, but as the hours passed, his forces remained frozen in place. The sight of Kobayakawa's inaction sent waves of uncertainty through the Western ranks. Commanders who had counted on his support began to question whether their carefully coordinated battle plan was falling apart. Messengers rode frantically between the scattered formations, carrying increasingly desperate orders that often contradicted each other. As the Western Army's command structure began to fracture under pressure, Mitsunari himself recognized the growing crisis. From his position near the center of the Western line, he could see that his army's morale was beginning to waver. The prolonged fighting had taken its toll, and the failure of key units to engage was sowing confusion throughout his forces. At 11 o'clock, he made the fateful decision to fire a signal flare, the predetermined command for an all-out assault that would either secure victory or result in catastrophic defeat. The rocket arced high into the gray sky, its brilliant flash visible across the entire battlefield. This was the moment that should have marked the turning point in favor of the Western Army, as fresh formations swept down from the hills to overwhelm the eastern forces in the valley below. Instead, it became the signal for betrayal on a scale that would echo through Japanese history. Kobayakawa Hideaki, who had spent the morning in apparent indecision, suddenly spurred his horse forward. But instead of attacking the Eastern Army as planned, his forces charged down the mountainside toward their former allies. The sight of 15,000 warriors bearing down on them sent shockwaves through the Western formations. Units that had been preparing to advance suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against men they had trusted with their backs. The betrayal created a domino effect that spread across the battlefield like wildfire. Other Western commanders who had been secretly negotiating with Ieyasu saw their opportunity and seized it. Kikawa Hiroi, commanding a crucial sector of the Mori forces, refused to advance when ordered, effectively removing 20,000 men from the battle at the moment when their support was most desperately needed. The carefully constructed Western coalition began to disintegrate as unit after unit either defected or simply withdrew from the fighting. From his command post, Ieyasu observed the collapse of enemy resistance with grim satisfaction. This was the culmination of months of patient work, turning his enemy's own allies against them through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and political manipulation. The Battle of Sekigahara was being won, not through superior tactics or martial prowess, but through the methodical corruption of his opponent's support base. The psychological impact of the mass defections proved as devastating as their military consequences. Western Army units that had been fighting courageously suddenly found themselves isolated and surrounded. Morale collapsed as word spread that their own allies had turned against them. Some formations attempted to retreat in good order, while others simply dissolved as individual samurai fled the field or switched sides to save their own lives. Mitsunari, witnessing the destruction of everything he had worked to build, made one final desperate attempt to rally his forces. Gathering the remnants of his personal retainers, he launched a direct assault on Ieyasu's command position, hoping that a successful strike against the enemy leader might still salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. It was a move born of desperation rather than strategy, but it demonstrated the unwavering loyalty that had made him Hideyoshi's most trusted administrator. The charge was doomed from the start. Ieyasu's guards, elite warriors who had protected their lord through decades of conflict, formed an impenetrable wall of steel around their master. Mitsunari's small force was quickly overwhelmed, though the man himself managed to escape into the mountains as his dream of preserving the Toyotomi legacy crumbled around him. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Battle of Sekigahara was effectively over. What had begun as one of the largest military engagements in Japanese history had ended in complete victory for the Eastern Army. The field was littered with the bodies of those who had remained loyal to the Western cause, while thousands more had been captured or had fled into the surrounding countryside. The speed and totality of the collapse stunned even Ieyasu's supporters. In the span of a few hours, the political landscape of Japan had been completely transformed. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that had defined the Sengoku period lay in ruins, replaced by the stark reality of Tokugawa dominance. The aged not with a gradual consoli of the warring states had endation of power, but with a single, decisive stroke that left no room for doubt about who would rule Japan. As the smoke cleared and the cries of the wounded echoed across the valley, it became clear that this battle had achieved something that centuries of warfare had failed to accomplish. For the first time in living memory, Japan faced the prospect of genuine unification under a single, unchallenged authority. The gamble that Ieyasu had been preparing for his entire life had paid off beyond his wildest expectations. The immediate aftermath of the battle would prove as crucial as the fighting itself, as the new master of Japan moved quickly to consolidate his victory and establish the foundations of a dynasty that would endure for centuries to come. Within hours of his triumph, Ieyasu demonstrated the calculated ruthlessness that had brought him to power. The pursuit of fleeing Western army remnants continued long after the formal battle had ended, as East-Anglers through army cavalry hunted down the mountain passes and forest paths surrounding Sekigahara. There would be no mercy for those who had dared to oppose the new order, no sanctuary for the defeated champions of a dying cause. The capture of Ishida Mitsunari, 3 days after the battle, marked the symbolic end of resistance to Tokugawa rule. The man who had orchestrated the grand coalition against Ieyasu was discovered hiding in a mountain temple, his dreams of preserving Hideyoshi's legacy reduced to ash and memory. His execution in Kyoto would serve as a stark reminder to any who might consider future rebellion. The loyal administrator who had served his master with unwavering devotion paid the ultimate price for his principles. Yet Ieyasu understood that true conquest required more than military victory. The redistribution of domains that followed Sekigahara revealed the depth of his political genius. Over 6 million koku worth of land changed hands as the new shogun rewarded his supporters and punished his enemies with surgical precision. Those who had remained neutral found their territories reduced, while those who had actively supported the Western army faced complete dispossession. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty to the Tokugawa would be rewarded, but opposition would be crushed without mercy. The speed with which major strongholds fell to Ieyasu's forces demonstrated the psychological impact of Sekigahara. Sawayama Castle, Mitsunari's own fortress, surrendered within days. Osaka Castle, the magnificent seat of Toyotomi power, opened its gates without resistance. The great daimyo who had seemed so formidable just weeks earlier now competed to demonstrate their submission to the new master of Japan. The complex web of alliances that had sustained decades of warfare dissolved overnight, replaced by the simple reality of Tokugawa dominance. Among those who benefited most from the post-battle redistribution were the turncoat commanders whose betrayal had secured victory. Kobayakawa Hideaki, despite his hesitation during the actual fighting, received substantial rewards for his eventual defection. The message to future generations of ambitious lords was clear: those who recognized the inevitable direction of history and positioned themselves accordingly would prosper under Tokugawa rule. Pragmatism trumped loyalty in the new order that was emerging from the ashes of the old. The gamble that began in the mist-shrouded valleys of Sekigahara had transformed Japan forever. In a single morning, Tokugawa Ieyasu had achieved what centuries of warfare could not: the complete unification of a fractured nation under one unchallenged ruler. His victory was built not just on military might, but on the patient cultivation of human weakness and ambition. The Tokugawa shogunate that emerged from this triumph would bring Japan over 2.5 centuries of peace, stability, and isolation from the outside world. From the ashes of the Warring States period rose a new Japan, one where the sword would finally be sheathed and the long nightmare of endless civil war would become nothing more than memory. Sekigahara proved that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the shadows where loyalty is bought and betrayal is carefully orchestrated. The last great gamble of feudal Japan had paid off, and a dynasty was born that would endure until the modern age.